So I imagine that there's a fair amount of celebrating in the Milne family in Blythe. And there it is tonight, and a little bit of chagrin perhaps on the part of those local Labour bosses who got rid of him. Now, what's the computer saying after these results? Here we are, with Conservatives got within 4 of the Labour Party at the moment, and there's still a little time to come. Liberals with 14. We have those 12 seats from Ulster, which it's difficult to call precisely how all the members will vote if it came to a question of organising the House of Commons, though we know and suspect how individuals might go. We have there the combined Scottish and Welsh nationalists, and they may well work as something of a coherent group. They've tried to do so in the past, and 3 others, including the Speaker, Mr Dick Taverne. Now, Graham.
Well, I just wanted to spell out that Milne, Selwyn, Lloyd and Taverne are the 3 others, and that's why those numbers don't add up to 635.
All right, well, it's plenty of the numbers game going on. We just got a little bit of news that, of course, Mr Kilfedder has held down north for the United Ulster Unionists. That's reverse. If you're taking it not in the terms that Mr Brian Faulkner thinks of it, there's the result. Roy Bradford is, of course, one of Mr Faulkner's ministers, and you can't actually add those figures up to say that there is a majority for the Sunningdale Agreement. Now, down north is a strongly Protestant area, just to the east of Belfast, commuter country, quite well-off country. And Mr Kilfedder, he racks up pretty big majorities most times.
But if his vote was going to decide things, he'd probably vote with the party he's been voting for in the lobbies at Westminster for some years now.
Probably he wouldn't actually go with a Labour government on some of the ideas that Labour has expressed about Northern Ireland, or some ministers in the Labour government have said. And now Robin Day, I think, is talking to Rennie Short, who's in Birmingham.
Yes, good afternoon again, Mr Short. Can you hear me, Mr Short? Can you hear me? Can you hear me, Mrs Short? No, Mrs Short can't hear me yet. Hello, Mrs Short. Well, now, just while we're waiting for Mrs Short to get her sound in order, I'll talk to my 3 journalistic colleagues. Ian Waller, how do you see this new situation? Do you think that Jeremy Thorpe is right when he says he's broken the 2-party system?
Well, he's broken it in one sense, in the sense that they've got a large number of votes, but he hasn't broken it in practice in the House of Commons.
Do you think he's got a hope of getting electoral reform?
Not the slightest hope, no. Mark, I think he's absolutely right when he says that there will be a great deal of resentment among the 5 million people who did vote Liberal, and also a feeling in the country of unfairness about the fact that 5 million people are only represented by perhaps a dozen members of Parliament at Westminster.
6 million, nearly
6 million now. Well, it's even worse. I mean, it's a staggering figure. Yes.
Alan Watkins, what do you think about this and the? What are your thoughts since we last talked, and in particular the Liberal achievement?
I think that if you're in business to win seats, and it's no good crying, it's not fair, which is what Jeremy Thorpe is doing. And I think that he's onto a loser here, and the British don't like people who keep whinging and whining, and this is what he's doing. He's had a great success down in the West Country on his personal vote, and good luck to him there. He's worked hard for it, but it is no good at all blaming the system, which is what every tin pot little revolutionary does, saying it's not fair. If you're in business, you should be able to...
If you want to change the system, you've got to say it, haven't you?
Well, no. If you
let me ask Mrs Rennie Short, who can now hear me, do you think Jeremy Thorpe is justified, Mrs Short, in saying, I've got nearly 6 million votes for my party, yet we've only got 10 seats so far, as against nearly 300 each for the other 2 parties? In other words, he said, you may have heard his press conference, takes 500,000 votes to elect 1 Liberal MP.
Well, I think that this is what the Liberals have been saying since the beginning of time, of course, and
well, the Labour Party said it in 1928 or 9. They introduced a bill for the alternative vote. Do you remember? You probably aren't old enough to remember.
Mr Day, since then we have managed to build up the party and present our party so that we win support and are able to form governments. And that really is the challenge to the Liberals. They haven't done it this time. In spite of all the ballyhoo and the upsurge of the Liberal vote, you know, yes, and the public opinion polls and the press and all that.
Yes. Now, what do you want what we're calling the shadow cabinet, but of course it isn't the shadow cabinet because there isn't one until the new Parliament assembles, but Mr Wilson and a group of his senior colleagues, what do you want them to be saying to Mr Wilson, Mrs Short?
It will be the cabinet, of course, when the government's formed, not the shadow cabinet.
Yes, indeed.
I want them to say, and I'm sure that this is what they will be saying, that Mr. Wilson must form his government, he must govern, he must carry on governing, and must go to the country in the fairly near future, I would have thought, on a major issue where he can win the support of the country and get a decisive majority.
Now, I want to bring in Andrew Alexander here, who's got some interesting theories on the impact of Mr. Powell's influence in your area, Mrs. Short, and see
yes.
whether you think he's talking sense or nonsense.
Well, you asked me about that last night, didn't you?
I know. I want to hear what Andrew Alexander, who's rather close to Mr. Powell in philosophy, some ways.
Well, the closeness I'm talking about at the moment is having looked at some of the figures of Wolverhampton itself, and I see that in the boundary readjustment it gained 2 wards in the Tettenhall wards, which were extremely strongly Conservative. It lost 3 wards which were tended to be Labour but not so markedly so, and I understand that in Wolverhampton Conservative Association there were some estimates the majority there should have been something like 20,000.
So what is your conclusion?
Well, if that is so, and the majority in fact was 6,900, then the impact of Mr. Powell there certainly was enormous.
Do you think it was an impact in Mrs. Short's seat?
Well, I'm not sure about North East. I've only looked at the boundary readjustment for South West, and Mrs. Short could tell me if there's any boundary readjustment for North East. I haven't looked at that one.
Mrs.
Oh
Short?
yes, I had a very considerable boundary review and had 30,000 new electors in my constituency. Yeah. I had 40,000 of the old constituency left and 30,000 new ones, so it was a very considerable change.
Mrs. Short, are you looking forward to a job in the Labour government?
I'd very much like to have a job, yes indeed.
Well, that's a jolly frank answer to give.
Of course, I'm always very frank, Mr. Day.
Most people
Don't you know
say
that?
Most people say that is, of course, a matter for the new Prime Minister.
Yeah, well, if Harold's any sense, he'll know what to do.
Thank you very much, Mrs. Short.
Well, we should now say that there will not be a Heath press conference at 3 o'clock. Our information about that was inaccurate, and certainly the situation would seem to justify Mr. Heath hanging on for a little while, because the position is that the gap has now narrowed to a Labour lead of only 4 over the Conservatives, and if you take into account some of these Northern Ireland results, and if the loyalists there were to decide that they didn't like the idea of a Labour government, they felt that it wasn't going to be in their interest in the present situation, then it might be that they might unofficially vote for the Conservatives in organising the House. And that would then perhaps throw the balance into the hands of the nationalist parties. And again, that would mean there are some nationalists who have some left-wing ideas, there are some who have some right-wing ideas. Would their cohesion hold up in this position? And so again, it really is, in many ways, a repetition of the situation in 1964. Sir Alec Douglas-Home stayed on in number 10 till almost the last results. Mr. Heath is doing so again now, and there is no guarantee at the moment that Mr. Wilson really could organise the new House of Commons. We must wait and see. Let's have a look at some of the results. No, we haven't got any. Let's have a little look at these results now. These are Conservative majorities coming in, and these, of course, are all helping Mr. Heath.
A slight swing for Mr. Heath's former private secretary in Norfolk South to the Conservatives, but Basingstoke moving nearer to being a marginal seat.
And some more safe seats there. Leominster, the Conservatives just hang on.
That was the Liberals' best hope. They got 41.7% of the vote. It was the Liberals told me it was their best hope in the West Midlands. Well, it obviously was worth trying. 4.5% behind the Conservatives.
Let's have a little look at the computer projection now that we were talking about. There's the Conservatives within 4 behind Labour, Liberals 14, and there's those 12 in Ulster, but if the Loyalists were to think of voting unofficially for Mr. Heath and the Nationalists, that is the situation of deadlock at the moment. I think it's time to have a word with one of the victors today. He won in the by-election, Alan Beath in Berwick. He's put his majority up at the general election, and Jake Kelly is talking to him at Berwick.
Alan Beath, what are your feelings now?
Oh, I'm delighted, obviously, to have held the seat and to have increased the majority.
Yes, it's gone up from 57, the last recount, the by-election, to 443. It's almost a non-marginal seat now, isn't it?
Well, in Liberal terms, yes, you know, but all our old ideas about which seats Liberals could win, which ones they could easily hold, have all gone out of the window. And in this situation, I'm delighted to have held this seat.
How confident were you to hold this?
I always thought that we could, but I never expected any sort of walkover or anything of that kind. I knew that it would be a keen contest. right up to the last minute.
What sort of a campaign was it here in Berwick?
I think in many ways a traditional campaign in which people came out to public meetings even more than they did in the by-election. Obviously people turned out and voted in larger numbers in the by-election. All the candidates, I think, were out meeting people in the traditional country type of election campaign.
Mr. Hardy, as the losing Conservative, you don't look too downhearted.
I'm very disappointed. I really am. I think this is a very sad day for Britain, that the government should be so neck and neck. I think this is very sad, and I'm disappointed about what's happened in Britain.
Why do you think you lost in Berwick? This is really the second time in a very short time.
Well, it appears quite clear that I lost this time. We put 3,000 onto our vote, so you can't say that that's not bad. We lost because the Socialist vote, they lost 2,000 and they wouldn't count. A lot of Socialists told me they're going to vote Liberal just to keep me out. I think that's exactly what's happened.
It's been a good campaign.
Oh, yeah.
Yes. No
Very
complaints about the campaign at all?
No
Thank
complaints.
Thank you both very much indeed. Congratulations again, Mr. Beath.
Thank you.
So there's the scene at Berwick-on-Tweed with a successful Liberal. I wonder if we can just call in at the Liberal Party headquarters where Mr. Thorpe is speaking. 24 seats still to come. Well, Mr. Thorpe's just blowing his nose.
While a minority Labour government, would the Liberals prevent it from taking Britain out of the common market?
Well, I don't think that as I say, it is fruitful to go into great details as to what would or would not be sticking points. But I think on that particular point I can say that no Liberal Party would vote for taking Britain out of the common market unless the common market dramatically changed from what it is at the moment. Improved conditions, yes. Fundamental renegotiation of the treaty terms, I think, is out. But renegotiations of things like hello? Fundamental things like, can you hear me?
You have somebody else on the line.
Oh, I see. Fundamental things like the renegotiation of the actual treaty is not on. But obviously improvement of the CAP, change in the regional policies, strengthening of the European Parliament, these have all been things which we Liberals have backed, and indeed most of my Liberal colleagues in Europe have. But to take Britain out of Europe, I can think of nothing that will be politically and economically more disastrous for this country.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. I think we've had the half an hour, and probably that interruption on the telephone call was to bring our discussion to an end. We'll look forward very much to seeing you in London on Monday, and the arrangements are all going ahead for that meeting.
Splendid. Well, I'll let you know when I arrive in London. I'll give you a ring over the weekend, and we might all meet earlier.
And I hope you manage to get some gardening tomorrow.
Very important, Eric. Thank you very much. And will you thank everyone for who's turned out?
I certainly will.
And will you send the Alderman back to Rochdale, which is where he belongs?
The Alderman will be going, I'm sure, fairly shortly.
Good.
Do you want to say goodbye to him?
Yes, I will.
Here he is.
Goodbye, Cyril.
I'm going to the Mayor's Ball in Rochdale tonight, and it's a Liberal mayor, so I reckon it'll be really a victory.
Very right and proper. The last mayor I met in Rochdale was a Labour one. That was yourself.
That's right, yeah.
Will you be having
It only goes to show what a great influence you have on minds that are willing to listen, Joe.
Will you have the Rochdale Brass Band out?
No, not tonight, but they were working quite hard last night.
Great, great. Well, Cyril, you've done a marvellous job, and I look forward to seeing you on Monday.
Thank you very much.
And give my love to Baroness Emma.
I will.
Okay?
Yeah.
Bless you.
Bye, Andy.
Goodbye.
And Mariam.
Cyril?
Yes?
Cyril?
Yes?
Marion is here.
Yes.
Would you like a word
Oh,
with
yes,
her?
I would.
Can you switch the camera over?
Yeah.
Hello?
How are you, my love?
Congratulations.
Thank you very much
Well done.
indeed, and to you and Jeremy.
Yes.
Yes, I'm sure you're very happy at any rate for Jeremy's sake.
We're very, very
Well, there's the Liberals, some domestic details where they're going to be tonight and tomorrow. But of course the situation is one with 22 results to come, and nobody can be quite sure what the outcome is going to be in the end. I'm not surprised Mr. Thorpe was nearly interrupted on the phone. There must be one or two people who are actually thinking of calling him to know what he might do, and he gave some interesting answers there, particularly about Europe. It's very obvious, I think, that a minority government, whether it was Labour or the Conservatives, might have some difficulty. So with the balance still so very tight, let's have a look now and see at some results which have come in. Here's Hexham, Geoffrey Rippon's results, Secretary for the Environment. And here, 2 Conservative, 1 Labour. Braintree's the interesting one there, Tony Newton, one of the bright young Tories from the Research Department.
Beats Keith Kyle, though a 2% swing to Labour there.
And some more results there. No change.
Tony Barber's old seat at Doncaster comfortably in the Labour column. And a Tavernite only getting 1.6 against Mendelsohn in Penistone.
Here's one where the Liberals ran well in the by-election, Mr. Giles Radici improving things for Labour at the general election.
The Liberals fall from 39% at the by-election to 26% in the general election.
Here's Malden. It was thought that it might be mildly marginal. It certainly hasn't proved that way.
Liberals in second place with 29% of the vote.
And another mining seat there, Normanton.
With a swing to the Conservatives, 1.2.
It's almost as though the miners were tired of voting.
Of course, one says a mining seat. Well, that is really genuinely a mining seat, but an awful lot of the mining seats just have a pocket of miners or 2 or 3 pits which don't dominate the seat really now any longer.
And we should just say 20 results to come in this deadlock situation. A second recount at Bodmin, where the Liberals still have some hopes. But let's have a word again with Graham, because we're really down to the nitty-gritty now, Graham.
Well, we are indeed, and we're almost down to personalities, I think, and that's not what the computer's good at. But anyway, the prediction stays the same, as I said last time. Conservatives 296, Labour 300. That's a Labour majority over Conservatives of 4, Liberal 14, 10 Nationalists, 3 others, and the 12 Ulster seats.
Well, David?
Of the 20 seats to come, an extraordinarily large number, 7 are in Scotland, 7 are in Northern Ireland, and there are those 2 recounts, the second and third recounts, in Bodmin and in Carmarthen, and we've got an extraordinarily large number of seats that can't be called. They're not Conservative Labour seats, but they're Labour Nationalist, Conservative Nationalist or Ulster seats.
Well, now, just checking back over the situation which has developed now, as the Tories have held some of these marginals, is it really legitimate to say that Mr. Wilson is likely to be the leader of the largest single party?
Oh, I think that's so. I think it'd be very, very difficult for the Conservatives, almost inconceivable for the Conservatives actually to overtake Labour, unless you count the Ulster Unionists as Conservatives. If you did count several of the Ulster Unionists, we don't know what's going to happen. We've only had 5 Ulster results. If several of the others were pro-Assembly Unionists or Ulster Unionists, you might say that he was the largest party, but it would be in the old days it would have been. If Ulster hadn't gone like Ulster's gone, then the Conservatives would be the largest party.
I'm sure they wouldn't like to vote for Mr. Heath because he's the man who wound up Stormont. On the other hand, they may say that he's the better of 2 propositions in the loyalist interest. However, again, we're waiting to hear, of course, from North Antrim, where the Reverend Ian Paisley will have some pungent remarks to make about what the future holds for him and for Northern Ireland.
As so many of us voters have discovered, politics is a choice of the lesser evil.
Well, that's called compromise or moderation, or who knows. I think we'll go now to here where Mr. Wilson has been speaking at Transport House, holding a press conference. Let's see. Oh, this is the one in Liverpool where Mr. Wilson was talking earlier.
Facing, it is of paramount importance that a government be quickly formed to get the country back to full-time work in order to be able to deal with the pressing economic problems which face us both at home and abroad. A month ago, the Conservatives had a working majority and nearly a year and a half to go. It is manifest that they have not received the mandate they sought for continuing their existing policies. But the whole country is anxious about the state of the nation, and this must mean that the new government must be at work as quickly as possible. I've nothing to add to that, nothing to subtract from it. I don't know if you want any operational or other questions you want to put to me.
Mr. Wilson, with the world exchanges about to open in Europe and later in the day in America, can you say anything which might add to the confidence of the world outside and so limit the eventual burdens the people of this country have to face?
I don't think I should make any statement at this time apart from what I've said.
Mr. Wilson, would you expect to be asked to Palace now in the light of the situation as it's developing?
I'm expecting to meet my senior parliamentary colleagues this afternoon. I can't begin to speculate about anything else.
You said precisely what time and where?
2:30 House of Commons.
Mr. Wilson is a student of political history. The pundits are telling us there are two precedents for this present deadlock situation, 1923 and 29. Do either of those appeal to you as particularly analogous to the present situation?
It is not my task at this moment to construe political history. As a student of political history, I have my views on these subjects, and I don't agree with all the pundits I've heard on the media this morning.
What do you mean by that? Where do you disagree?
I thought they were wrong.
Could you say what the implication would be of Tories having more votes but less seats than Labour?
Labour had more votes and less seats than the Conservatives in 1951.
Mr. Wilson.
It was the beginning of 13 years of Conservative rule.
Mr. Wilson, could you carry out the policies of the Labour Party with a minority government? I'm thinking specifically of renegotiating Europe. Would not the Liberals move in there to prevent you carrying out that?
I don't think I can add further to what I've said. We are, at the moment, this is all purely hypothetical at this moment.
Mr. Wilson, have you been in touch with anyone in the government? Sorry.
No.
Is there any bar to minority government at the moment, as you see it?
Well, I was asked this question last night. I said I thought it was not the best way of running government, but there might be no alternative.
Would you expect another election?
Mr. Wilson saying there that there might be no alternative. Plainly, it's not a very attractive proposition for him, although he was very bright when he got back to London. There are 18 results still to come. The House of Commons may well be difficult to organise unless the Liberals or some other bloc were to throw their support quite solidly behind one or other of the major parties. That doesn't seem to be happening at the moment, but let's have a comment on that, going to Liberal Party headquarters, where Martin Bell is talking to Cyril Smith.
Mr. Smith, are you preparing to throw your weight, if I may put it that way, behind one bloc or the other?
Not preparing to do anything at the moment. We're waiting to see what the final results are. And as Jeremy Thorpe has said on his press interview this afternoon, it's for the other parties to make the approach.
Do you not feel that the Liberals would have a part to play in unifying the nation, as you've put it in this way?
Yes, I do very much. I do think we have a part to play in unifying the nation, and we are willing to play it. As to whether or not we are allowed to play it depends, in fact, on the other parties.
Do you have any preference for one party or the other if it comes to a working arrangement?
I may well have a preference, but I'm not prepared to state it publicly.
And do you have any ideas of the preconditions that you might set?
No, I think, again, that Jeremy Thorpe was absolutely right. It would be quite wrong to enter any negotiations with preconditions. Indeed, if I may say so, I think that's been one of the weaknesses of the last government in terms of its industrial relations.
But yet electoral reform must seem more important to you perhaps today even than it did yesterday.
Well, I don't know whether one could say more important. As far as I'm concerned, I've taken part in the campaign in 33 constituencies during this election, and I've certainly referred to electoral reform in a large number of speeches that I've made throughout the country. And therefore, as far as I'm concerned, it was important yesterday. All that I can say in terms of it being more important today is that now that the stupidity of the existing system has been spotlighted and highlighted, it is possibly more important in the sense that the country now understands the point that the Liberals have been making for many years.
At the same time, is the country going to expect the Liberals to show very soon where they stand?
Yes, and certainly we're prepared to show where we stand at the appropriate time. The appropriate time is presumably over the weekend. We are certainly meeting on Monday at the latest. It's possible that we would have to meet before that, the things in the balance, but certainly not later than Monday. And of course, presumably, if Mr. Thorpe were contacted by the leaders of either of the other parties, he would be summoning us to come back before Monday. But the thing is not in fact in our hands. And I think it would be quite wrong for us to say where we stand, purely because it depends where we are allowed to stand.
Are you expecting an approach from one side or the other?
I personally am not expecting. When I say personally, I mean I would not expect an approach from either of the other parties, but it's possible.
You wouldn't expect to be ignored in a situation like this?
I wouldn't not only not expect not to be ignored, but I am not prepared to be ignored. By that, what I mean is that if they ignore us in terms of forming the government, they certainly will not ignore us in the House of Commons. If I might say so, one of the things that has struck me throughout the whole of television interviews today, nobody's talked about the next election, except that we've sort of said we've got a number of second places and so on. But what you must not overlook is that if the Liberals hold the balance of power, it could very well be the Liberals that determine the date of the next election, not the new Prime Minister.
Well, let's talk about the next election just for a moment. Do you see this, what's happened, with even the handful of seats you've got, as being a springboard to some major advance?
Yes, absolutely. I don't know the exact figure. I had it at 1 o'clock, but we're certainly in second place in close on 200 seats. Clearly, the first thing that a Liberal has always got to do is to convince the electorate that he can win.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Smith.
Can you hear me, Mr. Smith?
Yes.
This is Robin Day.
Yes, Robin.
I just wanted to know, you might like to know that Mr. David Steele won Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peoples.
I'm highly delighted.
And so that, you've got 11 on our scoreboard now.
Good, he's a worthy winner.
You wouldn't like to reconsider your position and tell us which that party is you prefer, would you?
No, I wouldn't. No.
It's not like you to keep something to yourself, is it?
It all depends who I'm talking to.
Well,
and in what circumstances.
You're talking to me and nobody's
listening. Yes, I know,
nobody's
Robin.
listening.
I love you, Robin. I love you, Robin.
Nobody's
I must say I
listening.
could have thumped you on the nose for the way you dealt with Steele on Monday. But,
that was Bob Mellish, not me.
But I love you, Robin. But, you know, you heard Jeremy say in his press conference that I'm one of the two politicians that he's spoken to overnight.
Yes.
And we have agreed, in fact, that we're not going to make any comment until we know.
Have a ball in Rochdale tonight.
I will, Robin.
Are you a good dancer?
I can dance, but I doubt very much, having had an hour and 20 minutes sleep so far, that whether I should be in a mood for dancing.
Thank you very much, Mr. Smith.
Thank you.
And now I've got with me A.J.P. Taylor, the great historian, and I would like to ask you, Alan Taylor,
Thank you very
the Queen has come back from Australia for probably what is the most difficult constitutional issue of her reign. The problem over Mr. Macmillan and Sir Alec Douglas-Home wasn't a very complicated one, was it? How difficult is the situation for the Queen? Does she just accept what Mr. Heath suggests, namely Mr. Wilson ought to come in as minority leader? Is there any option?
Of course, well, there are always options. If a Prime Minister resigns, from that moment, technically, the Queen is on her own until she sends for somebody else. There's no obligation on her, supposing Mr. Heath resigns. I'm not saying he will. There's no obligation on the Queen to accept his advice or even to ask for it.
Would you expect, from your reading of all the Royal Archives and so on, to assume that Mr. Heath will go to the palace in this situation this evening, assuming he's still behind Labour, and say, Ma'am, I suggest you send for Mr. Wilson?
I don't think one can assume anything one way or the other. I'm inclined to think, because people get so rigid over these things now, that even if he is only 1 or 2 behind Labour, that Mr. Heath will resign. But there's no need for him to do so, and there are precedents the other way. Indeed, there is something to be said for the view, it would clear things up, if Mr. Heath remained Prime Minister until Parliament met, and so you can get a clear decision that at that moment, supposing that the Liberals and other independents all voted against this Conservative government, there would then be an obligation on them to support the Labour government.
There are 2 arguments against that. One is the very difficult economic situation, and the other is the precedent of 1929 when Baldwin did resign in quite a similar situation.
Yes, the margin was larger.
Yes. The Liberals had many more votes.
And also there was a bigger gap between Labour and Conservative. That was the thing which weighed with Baldwin, that there was a gap of, I think, 15 or so between instead of 2 or 3.
As a historian, how do you read this election? What have the British people said? Have they said a plague on both your houses, or what have they done?
To some extent, I think that's true, that there has been obviously a very considerable Liberal revival, that if there'd been no such revival, the votes would have gone one way or the other, one can't predict which way.
Is it a genuine Liberal revival? Because after all, the Scottish nationalists have taken the protest vote and the Welsh nationalists...
No, I agree. In my opinion, it is a negative thing. It's much more a vote against the 2 major parties than in favour of something. After all, it would be impossible. I hope I'm not making a political comment. It would be impossible to deduce from the Liberals what their programme is on almost anything except possibly the common market. But on other things, it's not at all clear where they stand. They keep talking about moderation. Well, that's what people always say when they can't decide which way to... Moderation means indecision. Well, there is no other definition for it.
Well, that's an interesting and provocative thought, if I may say so, a Donish epigram, which I would like
easily to me.
Which I would like to pass on to Alistair Burnet, that moderation is another word for indecision.
Well, I'd just like to go back, because I think we may have missed one of the significant things that Mr. Cyril Smith said. He said that he thought the Liberals should determine the date of the next general election rather than the next Prime Minister determining it. And he also made very clear, as Mr. Thorpe did, the Liberals' concern about proportional representation. Mr. Thorpe, for example, talked about cheats, an unfair system, and so on. Now, plainly, if the Liberals, according to Mr. Smith, and I hope I haven't misunderstood him, and I think he meant that if the Liberals threw their support behind one of the major parties, when that party became unpopular, if the Liberals withdrew that support and forced a general election, well, they would do it at the very moment, say, at the time of a Parliament when the Liberals do well, say at Orpington or at Sutton and Cheam and so on. And I think that was a tactic that Mr. Smith had at the back of his head, and is certainly one of the reasons why perhaps neither of the major parties may be all that interested in picking up the telephone to Mr. Jeremy Thorpe. Well, we don't know. They may be phoning Mr. Thorpe at this time, but I suspect it's that kind of problem about the solidity of any Liberal support which must be a worry at the back of Mr. Wilson's head, and would indeed perhaps be at the back of Mr. Heath's head in that situation. So let's have a look now at what the computer is projecting in this position. And we have Labour just edging up by one there, 5 ahead of the Conservatives. But of course Labour have lost a seat to the Scottish Nationalists while we were away there. Liberals with 14, those 12 in Ulster, and many of those might in fact vote in the end with the Conservatives, others 12. And, as we say, Mr. Wilson has lost a seat at Stirlingshire East and Clackmannanshire, where the Scottish Nationalists have come in. This is one, Mr. Richard Douglas was the member there, and Mr. George Reid, who of course is extremely well known in Scotland. He's been a television commentator on politics for Scottish television for a number of years, and perhaps because it's a personality vote, certainly helped him, I'm sure, to that Scottish Nationalist success.
He jumps from 16% to 44% of the vote in Stirling and East Clackmannan.
And here's Monmouthshire, the Conservative, back home.
This was a seat that Labour might have won if there'd been a swing the other way in Wales, but the Conservative is comfortably home.
They took the old Monmouth, didn't they, in 1966?
And it's made a little worse for Labour by redistribution.
And here's a personal success, I think, of Mr. David Steele. I wonder if we can get these figures. Yes, there we are. Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles, was thought Mr. Steele might be in trouble if the SNP, the Nationalists, had run really strongly, but they didn't, and Mr. Steele is back quite comfortably there.
Except in Galloway, they haven't run strongly in the lowlands, but a very big majority there. I mean, the Liberal leaders have all done terribly well. 9,000 for David Steele, 8,000 for John Pardoe, 11,000 for Jeremy Thorpe, and 8,000, 9,000 for Cyril Smith, and 8,000 for Clement Foy. Those are very, very impressive margins, and indeed 7,000 for the Liberal, Mr. Ross, who made a breakthrough in the Isle of Wight in a rather unexpected way.
All right, well, that's the situation. And I think we have a chance now to go to Keith Graves at Labour Party headquarters for a report.
It would be very interesting at the moment if we could have our cameras in that room there where the shadow cabinet has been in session for about half an hour. No clues from the people that were invited to how Mr. Wilson would see a government if he was asked to form one. All 15 members of the shadow cabinet were invited. 2 major absentees at the moment, Mr. Callaghan, who is still on the way from Cardiff and would obviously have a lot to say, and Mr. Michael Foot, who's also on the way from Wales, and he presumably would have an awful lot to say about any government that was going to be formed by Mr. Wilson. Results are being fed into the meeting. They've got 2 television sets in there, and we've been told that they're also discussing the constitutional position, so that if the call does come, Mr. Wilson would be ready with an answer one way or the other. No clues as to which way his answer would go. We understand also that Mr. Wilson has said the meeting will not finish before 4:30 at the earliest. This is Keith Graves inside Transport House.
And I don't doubt that one of the things they're waiting for is some indication of what Mr. Heath's intentions are. Mr. Heath has not spoken today, and he is plainly awaiting to see how this election does come out. And where you're dealing with Mr. Heath, you're dealing with a man with a great deal of willpower. one has to contrast, I think, this reluctance of Mr. Heath to concede defeat and certainly leaving options open right up to the very last moment with the speech made by Mr. Whitelaw this morning and in his constituency up there, Penrith and the border. And he was then saying that you had to accept the verdict of the people. The people had spoken. Now, if you take the actual majority of votes cast, then the Conservatives are the largest single party. If you take the seats, they're now, as you can see there, within 6 of Labour. That's just slipped a little. Mr. Whitelaw, however, I thought from the tone of his voice, suggested that the Conservatives had failed in their election argument, and the argument, whoever had won, had gone against them. We'll have a little look now at, we're waiting for these last results to come in. They're very important indeed, particularly to Scottish nationalists, to the Liberals in Bodmin and the Conservatives in Bodmin. Let's have a look at some of the results which we have in hand. Here's Mr. Charles Laughlin, I think, in Gloucestershire West.
This is one that might almost have gone against the tide. A slight swing to Labour, enough to keep him safe. If it had been the other way, like it was in next door Monmouth, he might have been in trouble.
I just wonder, David, really, whether, in fact, the new register has helped in some of these seats to hold them.
Yes, I think there'll be some Conservatives tantalised they didn't have the election on February the 7th.
Well, here's Sir Paul Bryan, who was a minister at the Department of Employment early on in the Heath government. Mr. Neil Kinnock back in Bedwellty.
Mr. Yeo and Mr. Morgan each just saved their deposit by a hair's breadth. Mr. Yeo 7 votes ahead of Mr. Morgan.
Well, the results are becoming few and far between now, but of course the speculation continues. And we have now the Labour Party conclave there with Mr. Wilson, and no doubt there's some fairly hectic advice being given there. This is the kind of situation where Mr. Wilson is usually extremely good, usually a very strong leader of his colleagues, and I think he will have made up his mind what he really intends to do. But the initiative, I think, David, now lies with Mr. Heath. What is he waiting for?
I don't know. I don't think anything can happen to these results which is fundamentally going to change the picture. There are only 3 English seats to come. 1 safe Labour, Brigg and Scunthorpe, 1 safe Conservative, Saffron Walden, and Bodmin, where they're on their second recount. There's only 1 seat from Wales, Carmarthen, where Grenville Evans, Plaid Cymru may be just ahead in the 3rd recount.
Now, do you suppose that Mr. Heath is in fact trying to put the Liberals on their mettle to come up with some policies?
Well, Mr. Thorpe is going to garden all weekend. We're hardly way of getting policy out.
Very Voltairean. Well, now I think we have an interview with Mr. James Callaghan.
This country's got such a situation facing it that it's got to have a government that's ready to take the right decisions and to go ahead and govern.
So as far as you're concerned, coalition is out. You stand there with Mr. Wilson?
We would stand on the policy we fought the election on.
You think
if anybody else wants to support us, they can, and I've answered quite enough of your questions, and thank you very much, and goodbye, and God bless you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Callaghan.
So here are the great Labour men coming to join Mr. Wilson there at Transport House. Mr. Callaghan there, obviously, in public at any rate, saying no concessions to anybody. I think the question must now be asked about the Liberals' position on Europe, although the official position of the party is that it is in favour of Britain's membership of the European Economic Community. Some of the polls in past months and years, and perhaps even some by-election results, have suggested that not exactly a majority of Liberal voters appear to be in favour of Britain being in Europe. And it might be an awful lot of tactics going on now, I think, David, because I'm sure all the parties are thinking of the next general election, however much they may say they don't want one and it's unnecessary and so on. This is a situation where the major parties, I think, want to put the Liberals on the spot and make them come up with some hard and fast
They're
points.
all going to be terribly tactical, and they're all going to try and pretend that they're not being tactical.
Well, here's the situation. David, would you like to look at the computer projection?
It's quite a complicated story. This is our best estimate of the strength of the Conservative and Labour parties, and with the Liberals there at 15, in a position not quite to put the Labour Party into a majority, even if they wanted to. The Nationalists at 9, and that probably means 3 Welsh Nationalists who rather indicated they would vote with Labour. 1 at least of the others, I think Mr. Blythe and perhaps Dick Taverne, would also support Labour. So Labour's not very far off a majority, but they haven't got it there. SDLP, those 2 would presumably support Labour. Jerry Fitt has said quite unequivocally that he would support Harold Wilson. But how the Ulster Unionists, probably those 6, mostly ex-MPs, would support the Labour, would support Mr. Heath if it came to a test, how Vanguard and Ian Paisley, the Democratic Unionists, would behave is open to question. You can play your arithmetic many ways. What interests me is how far people do reach out too far with making commitments. They've got words they don't like eating. I thought Jim Callaghan came slightly near to it, as Jeremy Thorpe has too, saying things that, if they're all true, then we're in for an unholy mess. Some people have got to give way on some of the things they've said if we're to get a decent government going.
Well, they're in a post-campaign state of shock, no doubt, as indeed a number of people are at what has happened. Perhaps even the electorate itself is not entirely sure at this moment what it wanted, but it certainly is now being informed of what it has contrived.
I hope we're not in a post-campaign state of shock, Alistair.
I think we're in a pre-campaign state of shock, David.
The October campaign.
Well, here we are. I think Alan Watson has got Sir John Foster, former Conservative MP, down there at Smith Square.
You can't now.
Alan Watson.
Well, in the studio here at Conservative Central Office in Smith Square, we have Sir John Foster, who for 45 years, I think, was the Member of Parliament from Northwich.
1945.
Sorry, 1945. Sorry, yes. Indeed. Sir John, we've seen the computer projections just now in the programme and the state of the parties so far. As it stands at the moment, can you see really any possibility of Mr. Heath being able to continue?
Yeah, I think there's a possibility. Rather interesting position, depends perhaps on the Ulster people, provided then the rest of the others don't go the other way. You've got a lot of combinations.
Well, of course, for the Conservative Party, Ulster is no longer the safe scene that it once was, is it?
No, and of course, in the old days you used to be able to count on most of the Ulster people, except one or two usually.
Could I ask you then what you expect Mr. Heath might be saying when he comes to Central Office, whenever it is this afternoon?
That I can't guess. He can either say, well, I'm going to resign because I've not got as many votes as the Labour Party, or he could say, I'm going to do, and my historical recollection isn't very good, but I got an idea this happened in 1885, but somebody'd have to correct me, that Lord Salisbury came in with a minority amount of supporters in the House of Commons.
It's certainly not without precedent. I'm sure Bob Mackenzie later on in this programme will tell us precisely.
Yes, I hope he will.
Of course, Mr. Whitelaw's already said today that he feels that the verdict of the electorate has really got to be taken note of at this stage. What do you think that must mean in this situation?
That rather looks...
I'm sorry, Sir John, we've got something coming through immediately.
And here's the count at Antrim North. This is the seat the Reverend Ian Paisley is fighting. And there he is in the forefront.
Waiting for the result of the election. It should be coming up almost at any moment. There are three candidates here. The Reverend Ian Paisley, Democratic Unionist, who's defending a majority of 2,500. Against him, Peter Utley, Unionist, who's associated with the Pro-Assembly group, and Miss Mary McAllister. I think we're almost ready for the result. The indications here are that there has been a surprisingly low poll, just over 60%.
Examine these figures.
65,000 voters have turned out of the 100,000 or so who were eligible to vote.
You better turn it.
The returning officer, Bob Williamson, is just running his final check on the figures here. There has, a short time ago, there was a check on the spoiled votes, and I noticed that a lot of the ballot papers, people had marked X against all three candidates, and then X'd out their names as well, just to make absolutely sure that the vote was well and truly spoiled. It's taken a surprisingly long time to come up with the result, 6 hours, but one of the hold-ups was the bringing of a ballot box from a remote island, Rathlin Island, off the North Antrim coast. All sorts of arrangements had been made in case the weather turned foul. There were going to be helicopters laid on, but in the end a motorboat did struggle across this morning, and a waiting police car brought the ballot box here about 2 hours after the poll opened. This was one of the areas in which there was a great deal of interest to see how the 100 or so islanders did vote. The indications are, of course, that Mr. Paisley, who's the leader of the Democratic Unionist Party, is going to go back with a greatly increased majority. I think, in fact, we're now coming up with the result.
I, the undersigned, being the Deputy Returning Officer for the constituency above mentioned, hereby give notice that the total number of votes given for each candidate at the election was as follows. McAllister Mary,
SDLP,
10,056. Paisley,
Democratic
Ian
Unionist.
Richard Kyle, 41,282. Utley, Thomas Edwin,
Unionist.
13,651. and the undermentioned person has been duly elected to serve as member for the said constituency, Paisley Ian Richard Kyle.
And so, with a majority of some 28,000, Reverend Ian Paisley is returned. Now, back to the studio.
Mr. Deputy Presiding Officer, Mr. Town Clerk, fellow candidates and fellow agents, it gives me the greatest possible pleasure this afternoon to propose to the staff that worked so diligently and well at the counting of the votes here today. We are all grateful that this election was not fought on the PR system, or we had been still here tomorrow night probably. And those of us who had the marathon at the Assembly elections know exactly what I'm speaking about. There's a couple of things that I must say this afternoon, and I don't intend to detain you long. First of all, there is the local issue in the North Antrim constituency. I raised the banner in 1969 against what I believe was a policy pursued by Terence O'Neill that could only end in the tragedy that we have had in Northern Ireland. I happen to be a Democrat. I believe in the processes of democracy, and I submitted myself to the electorate. And then I fought in the by-election and won the Bandside seat. And then I submitted myself to the electorate for Westminster, and I defeated the sitting member, Mr. Henry Clark. On that occasion, the total number of votes cast against me was 34,308, and I had a vote of 24,130. With a majority over the official Unionist candidate and sitting member, Mr. Henry Clark, of 2,641. This afternoon I have had a majority of 27,631 over the official Unionist candidate, and an overall majority of 17,575. With all due respect to any of the official Unionists that may mutter, I just want to say that we happen to believe in North Antrim in the ballot box and not in the bomb. We believe that those that want to rule this country should submit themselves totally and absolutely to the electorate, as we have done in this election. The local issues in this election were fought across the constituency, and there's no need for a rehash of them here today. But there is something that needs to be said, and it needs to be said now with great clarity and with the firmness that the British government need to take notice of. Mr. Faulkner says this election is not a success for the United Unionists. He says that these majorities mean nothing. He says that the democratic process can be subverted in order that he can carry on in his illegitimate form of government in an executive selected and not elected by the people of Northern Ireland. And the two main parties across the water have said clearly through their spokesman that whatever happens today in Northern Ireland, they will...
And there is the Reverend Ian Paisley, his speech there, and of course not missing his two most familiar targets, Terence O'Neill, who was his first political opponent, and now, of course, Brian Faulkner. We hope to have some words with Mr. Paisley after his remarkable result in a few moments. It was said of Mr. Paisley by a poet of Northern Ireland that he had lambasted and lambegged his way across the province, and it is clear that that progress has not yet been completed. Some more results. Here we have a Labour seat, not really marginal.
But a swing to the Conservatives in this steel town, a 1.2% swing to the Conservatives against the tide just south of the Humber.
And results are few and far between at the moment, and of course we will be bringing them. Some of them, of course, are going to be very late on indeed up in the Scottish Highlands. It's not the best kind of campaigning weather or vote collecting weather, and I don't think we expect results from places like Argyll or Inverness or indeed Joe Grimmon's result up there in Orkney and Shetland until perhaps very late. Now we should just say that we are, of course, continuing this programme because of this very close result, because of the major importance of the events of this afternoon and this evening for the future government of the country. I'm sure that those who have switched on for their regular programmes will understand that this is what we are doing and why we're doing it. Robert Mackenzie.
I'd like to look at the total vote again, but just one word in reply to Sir John Foster, who asked about precedents for minority governments. His Victorian example, I think, a little different because the party system wasn't quite as highly developed as now, but we haven't noted yet that apart from, in addition to the two MacDonald minority governments in 24 and 29, the two Asquith governments, which came in 1910, where there were two elections, and indeed the government that led into the First World War, did not have a working majority on its own. It had to depend on the Irish and on the Labour Party to govern, and it did so with some considerable success. It's worth remembering there are precedents in the century. Yeah.
Of course, Bob, they have to depend on the Irish, the Welsh and the Scots.
That's right. But I mean, again, one forgets that there is lots of precedents, apart from that one, the two of MacDonald's governments, that the Asquith governments really were not on their own. You go back, now there was the Liberal government of 1892.
And that's another terrible precedent, two general elections in 1 year.
Yeah, well, that could be...
All right, let's see, we'll hear what Sir John says to Robert Mackenzie now.
Sir John Foster, you heard there Bob Mackenzie talking about precedents in this century and making the point that even if those governments were short-lived, to some extent they enjoyed success. Do you think it is a real possibility that Mr. Heath may try to continue with a minority government?
Yes, on the two minority governments, 1924 and I think it was 1929, they weren't a great success, as we know. And theoretically, Mr. Heath could stay as Prime Minister, bring in the Queen's speech, then there'd be an amendment and see what happens.
How important in that judgment do you think it may be that it appears that the Conservative vote overall is slightly larger than that of the Labour Party?
Myself, I don't attach much importance to it. Of course, the Liberals are attaching great weight to the fact that they have this great number of votes. But I've always thought from the beginning of this election that we'd see the Liberals with a great number of votes and very few extra seats, between 15 and 20, I thought. And, of course, if you have more candidates, you have more votes. But undoubtedly there have been more people voting Liberal.
Given the character of the Prime Minister, having watched him in the House of Commons, what do you actually expect him to do?
No, I think you can't really foretell that.
No.
It's open to him to do either, and there are good reasons in my view for either course.
Mm-hmm.
It depends a little bit on one's analysis of what the Irish are going to do, and I'm not familiar enough with their politics and the nature of their candidacy to do that.
That's clearly a very different position. Fine. Thank you very much, Sir John.
The man who asked the country to give him a strong majority for the next 5 years has been inside this House all day trying to decide whether he can or should or will or won't carry on the government, or whether he should go to the palace and tender his resignation this afternoon to the Queen. A silence so profound, I've not known one like it, has emanated from Number 10 today. Virtually nothing has happened all day here except the coming and going of members of the Downing Street staff. We do know that he's been consulting with Jim Pryor, with Lord Carrington, with Anthony Barber, with Robert Carr, not with Willie Whitelaw, who, as I think you probably saw, went back to bed with flu. But those conversations have been going on. Not a word has leaked out about what may be taking place inside, except that quite clearly Mr. Heath is sticking there until he sees exactly what the position is and will then make up his mind. What has happened is that a crowd of about 200 or 300 people has gathered here at Downing Street. I'm curious to know why. What are you actually waiting for?
Well, just to see what comes on, you know.
What have you seen so far?
Nothing here since I've been here.
How long have you been here?
Oh, I've not been too long.
Not as long as I've been.
How long have you been here?
I've been here since 10 o'clock this morning, but that's all right. That's my job and I'm paid for it. I don't mind. What do you think ought to happen? Are you worried about the way that things are turning out?
Well, I will be, yes. I think so. If the Labour gets in, goodness knows what's going to happen.
What are you waiting here for?
To see who the new Prime Minister is going to be.
May have to wait a long time if you're going to wait for that. What do you think ought to happen? Do you think there should be a coalition, or do you want to see Labour go in?
I think that, you know, for the good of the country, the politicians should join together and help to put the country back on its feet.
Now, you sound as if you've come from
Wales.
From Wales, yes.
Yes.
What do you think of the Welsh nationalist vote? They've not done too badly in 1 or 2 seats.
Well, I haven't heard, because being in London last night, we haven't heard how the Welsh...
Are you from there as well?
Yes.
Are you worried by the way things are turning out?
Yes, yes.
Would you like to see a coalition? Do you think that...
Well, I think
what would you like to think Mr. Heath was deciding in there at the moment?
Well, I wouldn't like to give it a guess at that.
What would you advise him?
Well, personally, I don't like Mr. Heath, so...
So you advise the Black Rover to come up and Mr. Heath to get in it and drive to the palace, in fact? Oh, goodness. They're very dangerous, these curves, aren't they? What are you actually waiting here for?
Just seeing what's going on here.
You're a visitor from abroad,
Yes, that's right.
Yes. What are you waiting here for?
I just happened to be passing by and hoped I might see something.
What do you think they should be... What do you think Mr. Heath should decide to do?
Go and see the Queen and tell him to advise Mr. Wilson to come in.
Thank you very much. Well, this is David Dimbleby in Downing Street, tripping off the pavements.
That, of course, is the kind of situation that the politicians are doing, I think, at the moment, too. Anyway, there's some advice from the man and woman in the street in Downing Street. We'll have a little look at how the Liberals have got on. This second day, they sometimes do well, and they have, in fact, racked up some good results today. Devon North, of course, there's Mr. Thorpe, and there's Mr. Cyril Smith in Rochdale. Hazel Grove, the Isle of Wight, there's the Surprise. Cardigan, Cornwall North, Sir John Pardoe. Montgomery, Mr. Houston. The Isle of Ely, Mr. Freud. Colne Valley, Mr. Richard Wainwright. Berwick-on-Tweed, Mr. Beath. And Roxburgh, Selkirk and Peebles, Mr. David Steele, making that seat to his own. And
they're
now
waiting
a man...
for Orkney and Inverness. They're Russell Johnson and Joe Goodman. And then they have hopes in Bodmin, where there's a recount, and conceivably in Ross and Cromarty.
And given that, we will go now to one of today's winners, Liberal Mr. Richard Wainwright. Robin Day is speaking to him.
Mr. Wainwright, did you see that Liberal roll of honour?
I did, and with great interest, because with the sole exception of Mr. Ross from the Isle of Wight, I know them all pretty intimately.
Well, now, Mr. Wainwright, we heard your colleague Cyril Smith say earlier that it would be the Liberals and not the new Prime Minister who would decide the date of the next election. That puts a very heavy responsibility on the Liberals, doesn't it?
Well, I think we've carried a heavy responsibility for many years in British politics.
It's a bit heavier now, isn't it?
Yes, but our great asset, in my opinion, and I found this when I was in Parliament in Mr. Wilson's government time, is that we are highly coherent as a body of MPs.
I can hear a lot of horse laughs in certain circles as you say that you have been notoriously non-coherent.
Well,
I wouldn't say incoherent.
They can go on laughing, but I maintain that under Mr. Grimmon's and Mr. Thorpe's leadership, we did present a very coherent front in the House of Commons as a result of long hours of mutual argument. We usually arrived at a coherent point of view, and this was backed by a remarkable absence of any kind of interpersonal rivalry.
Of course, even if that were so, the Liberals are not the only minority group. And, of course, the next date of the next general election may, of course, also depend on people like the Reverend Paisley and Plaid Cymru and nationalists and all sorts of people who are not in the mainstream of political thought.
Well, indeed, but I guess that their difficulty, judging from the nationalists who were in the Parliament that I sat in, their difficulty will be a great lack of coherence, unless there's been remarkable change in the last few days.
Thank you very much, Mr. Wainwright, for joining us.
Thank you.
Mr. Wainwright, back for the Colne Valley. Let's have a look at his result. There it is. That must give him some satisfaction. Of course, all this is always nip and tuck in the Colne Valley between Liberal and Labour.
88% turnout, which is the highest, 88.8 No, 80.8, I think there may be a no, 88.3. It is the highest turnout I've noted tonight. I don't know if it is tonight.
And let's have a word here. A number of heads have rolled, but we understand that one of them that has gone today is Mr. Campbell Adamson, the Director General of the Confederation of British Industry. Our understanding is that he has submitted his resignation. You will recall that 2 days or so before the election, Mr. Adamson made a speech in which he criticised the Industrial Relations Act. In many ways it was a private speech, but it was given much publicity, and this clearly got across the views of some members of the CBI. He was strongly criticised, and so Mr. Campbell Adamson, it appears, has submitted his resignation. So this is a time of many passing faces and phases, and no doubt Mr. Heath will reflect perhaps on hearing that bit of news. That was one of the pieces of information which didn't help the Conservatives in the final days of the campaign, some others being, of course, the trade figures and so on. Well, that's the news from all the fronts, from the political front and from the industrial one. And, Robin, I think you've got some people well qualified to discuss them.
Yes, indeed. What do you think about this Campbell Adamson submitting his resignation? I'm not quite clear whether that means he's resigned or whether he's been sacked, because it seems to me that he would in fact be, from Mr. Wilson's point of view, be quite an acceptable Director General of the CBI to take part in all the talks that Mr. Wilson is going to have.
Yes, or a life peer. That might well be his fate. But I think it'll be seen as a pretty vindictive act by the CBI.
You think he's been sacked?
Oh, well, I don't see any other explanation, because he made this speech.
Perhaps he's a man of honour who thought he'd made a boob.
I don't think in the real world things happen quite in this way, and that if people had said to Campbell Adamson, look, you said the right thing, you said that this act had been a disaster, which I personally don't agree with, actually. I think it's, in some respects, quite a good act. But if people had come to him and said this, he'd have stayed on. On the other hand, I think that what's happened is that people have come to him and said, look, we can't have you spoiling the employers' party, the Tory party.
Yeah, with respect, I don't think the CBI would see it that way. The CBI must know by now that the likelihood is that there will be a Labour government. They would therefore be, I would have thought, unlikely to ask for the resignation of a Director General who was clearly highly acceptable to a Labour government.
I think Alistair Burnett just wants to chip in there.
Yes, I'd just like to clear a thing up here, Robin. I'm not sure that we've given you the precise, and my form of words was wrong. The position, as I understand it, is that Mr. Campbell Adamson has tendered his resignation. We do not know that it has been accepted, and it appears that some consultations are to go on.
Well, that's precisely why I raised the question as to your very carefully phrased report on it. May we move on from that particular item to ask you, political pundits, which is the only word I can think of after all these hours, much as I dislike it.
What do you think? Be a compliment or not?
You can take it either way, and I'll tell you after you've given your answer. What do you think the Shadow Cabinet are saying to one another, or what was the Shadow Cabinet and maybe the Cabinet at this moment?
The Shadow Cabinet?
Yes, Wilson and his chum.
What are they saying to each other? Well, they're first of all clearly deciding on what to do if there is an overall, not an overall, but a Labour lead over the Conservatives. And I'm not the slightest doubt that they would decide to take office, that Mr. Wilson should accept the commission from the Queen, and that he should reject out of hand any question whatsoever of dealings, negotiations, or anything else with the Liberals, the Nationalists, or anything else, that he should pursue the Labour Party's policy and programme and challenge the Liberals to dare to bring him down. Now, I think there is one very important and interesting point here. So, a government can manage on a very small majority quite easily if the other side is in disarray. And I think that the Conservative Party, after the setback they've had, will not be in a position for a year or so to be wanting another general election.
What about the point that the minority is not just 15 coherent Liberals, as Mr. Wainwright described them, but also consists of a lot of unpredictable people like Dr. Paisley and the Nationalists and various people.
Well, I would have thought the one thing that would have united a lot of these people, almost everyone in the House, is that they will not want another election soon, which means almost certainly a period of Labour government. Because if you look at the novices who've come to the House, not just on the Labour side, but among the the Independents, the others, the Ulster Unionists and so on, they haven't, and the Liberals, they haven't gone straight to the House in order to come out again within a few weeks. They want to stay there, they want to make their mark. They're people who haven't been there before. They certainly will be in no hurry to have an election, A, because it would be unpopular with the country, and B, because they want to get the feel of the House before they throw everything to the winds and risk an election.
You've been listening to these journalists who deal with the day-to-day froth of events. You look back with the perspective of history. Alan Taylor, do you read their analysis right, that there's not going to be an early election?
No, I agree with that. I agree with that. For whatever reason, I don't think there'll be an early election. I can't think of any case where you've had an election immediately brought forward simply because the results are unsatisfactory. And experience shows if you try something like that, it'll come out very much the same all over again.
Well, in 50 it took another year, didn't it? It was 18 months.
Yes,
and
18 months.
In 64 it was again about 18 months.
In 10 it took 9 months, but of course that wasn't the fault of the Commons, it was the fault of the House of Lords. So
Yes.
that's not a fair...
That situation doesn't arise now.
No, I don't think there's any chance the House of Lords forcing the government to have another general election.
So you see an election coming up within a year?
These minority groups can simply abstain.
Even so, I don't see the Liberals, for instance, abstaining
I'm not talking
or
about
approving
them.
of, say, pulling out of the common market. Or
that won't come up for a long time.
Oh, at the Labour Party press conferences they were saying within a year.
No, well...
Within a year, Peter Shaw was saying.
Let us get the Labour Party's position clear on this, to seek to renegotiate the Treaty of Rome, or the Treaty of Accession, and then to put whatever is renegotiated to the country in a fresh general election. So the question of the...
Or a referendum.
Or a referendum. So
Yes,
the
that
question of the
wouldn't
Liberal
necessarily
Party...
happen, but I would develop Ian's point further and say that the renegotiation will be what's called by the constitutional lawyers an executive act, which doesn't require legislative approval, and some chap will be dispatched to Brussels to muck around and make speeches and lobby people and all the rest of it. But this won't require a parliamentary vote, and a parliamentary vote, if it is required at all, will be required only at a very late stage.
Yes.
So therefore it is not a crucial issue.
One point I was going to say here. The Labour, if there were a Labour government, they might well put a reference in the Queen's speech to renegotiating, but as this can be a vague phrase, on the one hand it satisfies their conscience, on the other hand it will not violate too severely the Liberal conscience if they have one.
It's actually in the Tory manifesto, that phrase.
Thank you very much indeed. Alistair?
And just to confirm that Mr. Campbell Adamson has submitted his resignation to the CBI. We believe he's done it twice, but it has not yet been accepted, so it's in suspension. A lot of discussion going on all around town at the moment. Here's some other political news. In the United States, the Watergate grand jury has indicted the former Attorney General, Mr. John Mitchell. We have no other details about that at the moment. According to other reports from Washington, the former presidential special assistant, Mr. Charles Colson, has also been indicted. Well, that's the aftermath of another election campaign. Well, now, David, everything really to play for still for the Scottish Nationalists, for the Liberals, for the Conservatives?
It is an extraordinary fact that of the 14 seats that are still to come, none is a dead cert, except perhaps Orkney in the current field. I don't understand.
It's been a very bitter fight there, of course.
It's been a bitter fight there. Well, I might say that none is a dead cert. We have recounts in Bodmin and Carmarthen. Bodmin, which must be a Liberal Conservative fight. Carmarthen, which presumably is a Labour Welsh Nationalist fight. In Western Isles, I suppose that the Scottish Nationalists should get back.
I must just take it back from you for a moment to go to Robin Day, who is talking to Ian Paisley from Northampton.
That's very good afternoon, Dr. Paisley. Can you hear me, Dr. Paisley?
Very, very faintly.
I can hear you beautifully as usual. Can you hear me?
Yes, very faintly, but I think I can pick out what you're saying.
Right, I will ask very simple questions. Are you going to vote so as to support a Harold Wilson minority government in Westminster?
You're asking me, will we work with a minority government at Westminster?
A Labour minority government.
Is that the question?
A Labour minority government.
Yes, well, I would like to say that those of us who stood as United Unionists will be forming a separate parliamentary party at Westminster. And our final discipline will be the good of Northern Ireland as we see it.
May I suggest that as a loyalist you might put the final good of the United Kingdom? May I suggest that you might also consider the final good of the United Kingdom and not merely one part of it?
Well, you see, we don't feel that the British government has recognised us properly as part of the United Kingdom. We feel that we've been relegated to a second-class citizenship. We have government by selection rather than election. We haven't even the British form of parliamentary democracy.
Would you therefore, would it be right to interpret your stand in the new Parliament as seeking to force, if it lay in your power, an early general election to bring down any government which did not do what you want to do in Northern Ireland?
Well, all we want the government to do is a very simple thing, to have a general election for the Assembly and for the new executive to submit itself to the people. Now, I don't see any reason why any British government should not be prepared to abide by the processes of democracy. We're not asking for an impossible thing, which would be ridiculous. We're asking, I think politics is the art of the possible.
May I ask you this, Dr. Paisley? The Labour Party has given the same pledge as the Conservative government that without the consent of the people of Northern Ireland, the majority, they would not alter the border or the constitutional status of Northern Ireland. Do you accept that as a pledge which the incoming Labour government, if there is one, will uphold in good faith?
I wonder, could you repeat that? You faded away and you've come back now.
Yes. Do you accept that an incoming Labour government would uphold the same pledge that the Conservative government gave, not to alter the constitutional position of Ulster without the consent of the majority of its people?
Well, you see, the Tory government swept away the pledge that was given to the Stormont Parliament, which was similar to that. And, of course, the Northern Ireland Constitution Act gives this pledge again. But what worries the people of Northern Ireland, will that pledge be swept away in the same manner as the pledge given by Mr. Attlee was swept away? We haven't too much faith in the word of the British government.
When you take your place at Westminster, Dr. Paisley, is my understanding correct that your vote will be determined primarily by Northern Ireland considerations and not by any overall national economic interest at a very difficult time, which after all affects the economy of Northern Ireland as well?
I would say that my vote and the vote of my friends would be in the interest of the whole of the United Kingdom, because the best thing to do for the United Kingdom is to get the Ulster problem solved. And surely if we got that solved, that would overall help the United Kingdom's government. We are going to make a proper and vital contribution to parliamentary life at Westminster.
Thank you, Dr. Paisley.
Thank you.
And that again must be food for thought for those who are constructing majority and minority governments at Westminster. We'll have a little look at the seats which are still to be declared now. Of course, there are recounts going on in some of them. We understand that at Carmarthen, the fourth recount will start at 4 o'clock. And, of course, we know about the recount at Bodmin. Well, now, Argyll, that'll be, of course, a very late one. There's some SNP hopes there. Bodmin, I mentioned. Ross and Cromarty, that has in the past been a fight between Conservatives and Liberals. Carmarthen, we've told you the fourth recount coming there. Western Isles, that's been considered safe for the Scottish Nationalists, and since the Labour vote appears to be divided, it may be so now. Antrim South, waiting for that result, but the Loyalists are running very strongly in that part of Northern Ireland. Armagh, Mid-Ulster, well, that's the seat of Bernadette Devlin, Mrs. McAliskey. Down south, that's Captain Orr, one would suppose, if the Loyalists are running the way they have been doing. Fermanagh and South Tyrone, well, that had rather an independent nationalist last time round. Londonderry, these perhaps we cannot call at this time. Inverness, that's Russell Johnston. It's been said to be one of the safer Liberal seats in Scotland. Russell Johnston, a doughty fighter. But of course the SNP are opposing him. They're not opposing Joe Grimmond in Orkney and Shetland. There's been a very bitter fight indeed between Liberal and Conservative. So that's the state of the situation. Let's have a look at some results which we have in hand. Norfolk North, a safe Conservative seat.
Slight swing to Labour, but it's redistributed into a safe seat. Of course, it was a Labour seat till 1970.
Saffron Walden, that's Mr. Peter Kirk, who of course has been leading the British delegation to the Assembly of the EEC.
Liberals second with 30% of the vote.
That was Rab Butler's old seat, and of course that's one perhaps that if Mr. Powell and his friends perhaps would have liked to have made a particular effort to hurt Mr. Kirk in that seat. Well, David, do you disagree with that little rundown that we had of the seats to come?
No, I don't. I think that we have got this extraordinary... We have it actually every election, that these seats are the most unpredictable. The ones that come in last are ones that are most... They come in last because they're in remote areas where they're difficult of getting the ballot boxes in, and they are outside the main national stream of politics, and therefore they're unpredictable. One thing that has struck me as I've looked at this, no two parties could form a coalition government with a clear majority except Conservative and Labour. If you put the Liberals on top of the Labour Party or the Liberals on top of the Conservative Party, it's still not enough. So you'd have to have a coalition of different kinds of nationalists with their different interests to make a majority.
So that's the grand coalition idea, and I suppose the only thing that would cause such a grand coalition to come into being would be very serious and severe economic danger to the country as a whole if no other solution were reached.
And I think it would have to be on a very limited time base, and it would be very uneasy. People would be manoeuvring for position for the moment when the grand coalition broke up.
Well now, Bob, how do you feel about a grand coalition?
Well, I was going to say on that it might be inexpedient if the crisis really gets deep in the next week or two for any one party to say under no circumstances, and expedient for one party to say on a limited period we will agree to work together for emergency measures, then agree on an election in October or whatever else. And there might be some advantage in it for one side at least to say we're prepared to do it, and that the others say why they wouldn't do it.
Now, you sometimes quote European and other examples to us, and of course it's not unusual in some countries in Western Europe to have quite specifically a caretaker government to see one through a few months or so.
I can't offhand think of any country, democracy in Western Europe except France at the moment, where one party has a single party government. Almost every other one is some kind of coalition or dependent upon some minority group and that kind of thing. So we shouldn't treat it as some kind of unique national disaster if every other Western European government ends up in something like this, and a number of Commonwealth countries have too. I mean, Bob Menzies, in his long period as Australian Prime Minister, had a kind of coalition with a minority party throughout.
The problem is to think of the honest broker who'll piece this together. It's not fair to ask the Queen to do it, and you've got to find somebody who is slightly above the party battle and yet of the political world. And who is there who's like that? You know, Powell? I don't think so.
Well, you may have some volunteers coming along, coming through in some newspapers over the weekend. But given that situation, Bob, you wouldn't think it would last very long, and therefore the consequence of having such a situation would presumably be a general election would follow it.
I think so, yes. And it would only happen if our economic situation were agreed to be so disastrous that a minority government might feel it wouldn't have world confidence to carry on.
Well, now let's go to Scotland, where Donny MacLeod is interviewing Winifred Ewing, successful in Murray and Nairn.
Winifred Ewing, the second time you've provided a political sensation, how did it come about that you defeated Gordon Campbell?
The people of Murray and Nairn wanted me. I was around from May, 5 days a fortnight. I worked very hard. The issues on which I fought appealed to them. I made it plain that I'm going there with 3 mandates. One is to get Kilbrandon implemented as a first step on the road to independence, though we want more than that. The other is to get a referendum on the EEC, which is very unpopular in a farming and fishing community like Murray and Nairn. And the third is to slow down this mad grab for our oil so that our lands are not ravished and made into a second Lanarkshire. And of course, to get the revenues to regenerate Scotland.
Many people have been putting the point to you that now the SNP bloc has a natural leader. Do you see it in that way?
We haven't elected our leader of our group yet, and
I'm
not making any remarks about it at all. It won't be a very enviable task, but we have a wonderful band. Those elected are all fine people, and I'm just so happy to be going to Westminster. I feel very privileged, first of all, to be the MP of Murray and Nairn, because it's such a wonderful part of Scotland, a wonderful way of life. No bitterness, no racial problems, no religious problems. I'm just very proud of that, and I'm going not alone, with a group.
Privilege it may be, but it's also tremendous responsibility in the very peculiar circumstances in which you now find yourself. Can we consider the SNP bloc, which might be 7 or 8, as a genuine political bloc? Where do you stand in relation to the sort of negotiation that might very well be going on even now in London?
We will examine every policy from the very simple viewpoint. Does this benefit the people of Scotland or not? And we will support a party that puts forward policies that benefit the people of Scotland.
the people of Scotland only, in a situation
Oh, no,
where...
I mean, you're a member of the British House of Commons. I was not that kind of MP. My record shows that I made speeches on many subjects. But we are here with a specific mandate. Scotland's raw deal is behind our success. And Scotland's aspirations to have the dignity of decision-making is behind our success. And we must always remember what mandate took us there.
Mrs. Ewing, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And plainly, of course, Mrs. Ewing serving notice there that the success of the British economy is one of the things that she's interested in. Of course, Scottish nationalism first for her, and Scotland's oil a very, very big factor. Just a piece of news from the United States. I was telling you about some of the indictments in the Watergate business. We've now heard that besides John Mitchell, the former Attorney General, and besides Mr. Coulson, the former presidential special assistant, Mr. Nixon's former Chief of Staff, Bob Haldeman, has also been indicted by the Watergate grand jury. And so there must be a fair amount of speculation in Washington now as to where that particular process is likely to end. Let's look at our own political process and what the projection is going to be for the result at the end of the day. Conservatives have narrowed again, only 3 behind Labour on that situation. Liberals 14, Nationalists 9, others 3, and then we switch over to the situation in Northern Ireland with the Ulster Unionists 6, SDLP 2, Vanguard 3, and a Democratic Unionist 1.
You can do an awful lot of theoretical playing around with that computer projection of making combinations and coalitions. You can't see any of them very stable, and you really can't see a Liberal, Ulster Unionist, Conservative coalition which would make up a majority. A Nationalist, SDLP, Labour one comes nearer to the possible, but it's not really very probable. I just find it almost inconceivable how you get a really working, solid coalition out of that.
So if it weren't an official caretaker government, it would have to be a government that worked on tolerance for some time.
Certainly.
And this would require, in particular, I think, from the Conservatives, that they accepted the election result, didn't try to stir things up, although they might disagree with the policies that Labour was going to take to get out of the problem, and that, of course, would require much self-restraint.
It would indeed. I think it's a very difficult situation, and any government is bound to be at the mercy of some nationalist group if it wants to have a guaranteed majority in the lobbies of the House of Commons.
And I think it's not beyond the realm of possibility, of course, to make a sort of tacit reading of the programs of these parties and to put forward certain things which would obviously lead them to be willing to entertain the idea of giving you some underwriting support. This is exactly what happens in the standard minority governments in Canada. The Liberals, supported by the Socialists tacitly, have been able to adopt a series of measures which the Socialists found acceptable. And then they don't lose face if the Liberals carry on.
This is a question, of course, of the psychology of politicians, and the point that David has been making, which I think is a very valid one. All this has really come rather suddenly to our politicians. They didn't actually think they were going to be caught in this trap because they've evaded it so often.
Right.
Well, there we are. I think let's have a little look at what is happening outside number 10 Downing Street. Let's go back to David Dimbleby.
In Downing Street, there was a view a moment ago that Mr. Heath might be about to leave number 10. This was because 2 of his official cars, the Black Rovers, drew up here. But in fact, neither of those is Mr. Heath's car, I gather, which is down at the bottom of Downing Street and hasn't yet come to number 10. And therefore it looks as though his departure isn't imminent. The other thing that caused the rumour was the arrival of large numbers of police, but I'm told that they've come because of the arrival of large numbers of spectators. So everybody is now standing here waiting for something to happen, and nobody has any idea whether anything will or won't happen. But we all stand patiently, and it may well be that we're here for several more hours before anything happens. At the windows of Downing Street, there are people looking out at us who've no doubt wondering what we're saying, perhaps even watching what we're saying on television. Mr. Heath's car is now, and that's another one, JUU 570. That is Mr. Heath's car, I think. Now backing up into position at number 10. Whether it stops there or... Yes, if it stops, it means he may be coming. If it goes straight back, it means the decision's not yet been taken. It's not yet been taken. When a car disappears to the left, it means that the Prime Minister's departure isn't imminent, though it may be closer. That the car now under the lamppost at the back is the Prime Minister's car, the other car is his backup car, so that everything is ready at Downing Street for the Prime Minister to leave. And one assumes that in a situation like this, these steps wouldn't be taken unless it was expected that the Prime Minister was in fact about to go to the palace, or possibly to go somewhere else, we don't know. But certainly the way that it's been played today, very quietly and no mention of anything that's happening, it's unlikely that his car would be produced unless it was thought he was about to go. And there's still people looking out from the windows of Downing Street down to here. Somebody at the window where Mrs. Wilson stood, the top right where Mrs. Wilson stood when Mr. Wilson went out of office in 1970. Okay. This is David Dimbleby in Downing Street.
And that's what the state of deadlock or stalemate or indecision or goodness knows what really does look like in real life. I must just continue the saga of Mr. Campbell Adamson. We're not trying to make it a saga, but an increasing number of details come out. The president of the CBI, Sir Michael Clapham, has released a letter saying that a careless remark, that's how he calls it, and garbled reporting, that's what he calls it, did not compare with Mr. Adamson's tremendous services to the CBI. But discussions continue too in that part of the forest. David?
Well, that is a different, very different part of the forest. I'm not sure that I'm really focusing on that. I'm just bewildered at the suggestion that I thought there was no racing. Yesterday there was no racing. Today and yesterday are beginning to merge in my mind.
Well, it's not a serious... of course, Newbury is quite a good meeting, but of course last time in 1970 I think they had to postpone the Ascot Gold Cup, which is really putting business before pleasure.
I only watch racing on the day after the poll, sitting in the studio here.
Well, you keep watching the races, and there are one or two other races going on which are really quite serious horse races out in the constituencies, these recounts which are plainly going to continue and which are going to mean that we will certainly end the afternoon in a very indecisive state about particular constituencies, just as the whole question of deadlock remains in the national situation. Mr. Wilson and his colleagues closeted, the Prime Minister, no stir there from Downing Street, the Liberals saying that they're going to keep out of it, nobody's talked to them, perhaps the others are in fact ignoring them, the Liberals saying that they're going to meet on Monday, though of course they could meet much quicker if somebody brought them in. That seems to be the situation. It is, quite simply, a state of deadlock, and I would have said at the moment still indecision. It may break at almost any moment, but we're waiting for that. While we're waiting, let's go to Belfast and a report from Vincent Hanna.
Well, this has been a day of tremendous triumph for the Loyalist coalition in Northern Ireland. The followers of Mr. Paisley, of Mr. Craig and Mr. West have swept the board in many of the seats. They have taken 50%, over 50% of the votes already cast. And of the 6 seats already declared, they have taken 5. It looks as if we're going to have 9 or 10 Loyalist MPs coming to Westminster to make problems for the new Prime Minister. In the words of one Loyalist to me, they have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. Now, with me in the studio is Mr. W.D. Flax, our political correspondent. How do you see the situation now?
Well, quite clearly, the United Unionists have succeeded beyond their wildest dreams, as you put it. It does look, in fact, as if they'll have about 10 seats at Westminster on the showing so far. I think there will be quite a problem for all the skill and diplomacy of Westminster here in this situation. The other day, Mr. Harry West, the new leader of the Unionist Party, he said that if, in fact, there was a majority in Northern Ireland, or a very strong vote against the Constitution Act, he said he wasn't making a threat, but he was expressing a fear that there might be trouble if, in fact, the decision of the people in Northern Ireland were ignored by Westminster. And I think this is where the great skill will be required by the new Secretary of State, whoever he is.
It seems to be a clear sense of disillusionment that the Ulster people have with Assembly policies and with the Executive.
Yes, I think, of course, the problem for the Executive is it's only been going for 2 months. And I don't think any government, particularly a new coalition government made up of Protestants and Catholics, a totally new concept of government, probably in Western Europe in many ways, didn't obviously have time to make any great impact in this very brief space of time. They were hoping, of course, for a referendum after about 6 months to test their policies. They've been caught out by this Westminster election, and perhaps to that extent, you know, the situation may be slightly falsified. But there's no disguising the triumph of the United Unionists on the face of it up to now.
I think that one point that's worth making is the fact that while on the Loyalist side they were completely united, on the other side, SDLP Alliance, etc., they were fragmenting the votes, splitting up, and sometimes putting minority Loyalist candidates in.
That's true, but of course one of the sort of agreements within this government obviously was that they would continue to operate as separate parties. You see, quite clearly Mr. Faulkner didn't feel that the time had come for Unionists, SDLP Alliance and what have you to go together to the country and face it as a united force. He didn't feel that, you know, the fragmentation of Ulster politics at this stage would allow that sort of campaign to be mounted.
Well, thank you very much, W.D. Flax. Now we're going to go to another key constituency which is going to declare soon, the seat held by Bernadette Devlin, now Bernadette McCalliskey, which is Mid-Ulster. And there, Brian Walker is at her outside broadcast point.
Well, the news from Mid-Ulster is that the count is still going on. The total poll is in something like 82%, and believe it or not, that's fairly low. It's down on the 1970 general election. The indications are, though, from all the parties concerned, that Mrs. McCalliskey, better known as Bernadette Devlin, of course, is not going to hold this seat. And all parties are saying that it looks very likely that the United Unionist, Mr. John Dunlop, is poised for victory here. Of course, the vote is not yet over, and there may be a turn-up, but that looks what it's like. Now, there are two reasons for that. One is that the Catholic vote and the Protestant vote, for that matter, is going to be split. Mrs. McCalliskey is being challenged for Catholic votes by Mr. Ivan Cooper, Minister of Community Relations in the power-sharing executive. He's going to try to come second, but it's hard to say whether he's going to make it. On the Protestant side, Mr. Dunlop is being challenged by Mr. Neville Thornton, who stood against the then Miss Devlin in 1970, but it looks as if he's going to take a very small share indeed of the Protestant votes. So it looks as if a low turnout by Catholics and the fact that the Catholic vote is split will cancel out the natural Catholic majority in Mid-Ulster and let the United Unionist, Mr. John Dunlop, in. That, of course, is at this stage only a projection. And I've heard a short time ago, as you may well have heard elsewhere, that Mr. Harry West, leader of the official Unionist Party, standing for the United Unionists, may very well take Fermanagh South Tyrone from Frank McManus. So it does look as if that there's going to be a clean sweep in the three western constituencies in Northern Ireland. Time now to hand back to Vincent Hanna in Belfast.
It's quite a day for the United Unionists, and with a board showing the state of the parties, we're now going to go back to London and to Alastair Burnett.
And that is really quite an important political situation. If those projections from Mid-Ulster and indeed from Fermanagh and South Tyrone are true, then the Unionists, Mr. Paisley, Mr. Craig, Mr. Harry West and Loyalists are going to go back as quite a sizable bloc. Indeed, they're going to go back with a bloc which will be second only to the Liberals in the new Westminster Parliament, and I don't doubt that they will use their muscle as well as their voices when the time comes. Let's have a little look at how the Scottish Nationalists have been getting on and some of the seats that have made them very happy in the course of the past 24 hours. Aberdeenshire East, Banff and Dundee East. All Scottish Nationalist Party gains, and of course we haven't got in there Winifred Ewing's gain in Murray and Nairn. Well, when Donnelly MacLeod was talking to Winifred Ewing, he said who's going to lead the Scottish Nationalists in Parliament, and she said, well, we haven't had an election for that, because they haven't had, of course, all the results in. But the leader of the Scottish Nationalist Party, Mr. William Woolf, hasn't got into Parliament at this time. There's perhaps, to some of us, think he may be left a little bit out on the limb. Let's see whether he has been. Magnus Magnusson is speaking to him in Glasgow. Magnus?
Well, here in Scotland, it's been a really sensational day for the Scottish National Party. They won these three spectacular seats, Murray and Nairn, where Mrs. Winnie Ewing ousted the Scottish Secretary, East Aberdeenshire, and Stirling and Clackmannan, where a TV man called George Reid overturned a huge majority and came sailing home from nowhere. And you add this to the two that they won yesterday for the loss of only one of their favourite people, admittedly, Mrs. Margaret MacDonald at Govan. Now, if we look at the state of the board, with 5 results still to come, Labour have 40 with a net loss of 3, the Conservative 20 with a net loss of 1, the Liberals 1 with no losses or gains, and the Scottish Nationalists have 5 seats, a net gain of 4 and a chance of 2 more still to come. Now, with me now we have the chairman of the Scottish National Party, Mr. William Woolf, looking very happy because he, in fact, forecast he'd get exactly the number of votes that he has done. But one of the problems with the SNP in Scotland is that they tend to be rather a boom and bust party. You boom at by-elections and you always lose the seats at elections.
Well, that hasn't happened. That hasn't happened this time. We've doubled our vote at every general election since 1959. We've done it again this time. 300,000 votes the last time, 600 votes. 600,000 this time. There's plenty of boom, but there's nothing bust about that.
But if there is another general election shortly, or this year as it may be, haven't you any fears that perhaps the striking gains you made this time might melt away like snow off a dike.
No, I think on the contrary, the other people in Scotland and other constituencies will be encouraged to give even more support to the Scottish National Party, because the issues on which we're campaigning are going to remain the same, whatever the government, whether it's Labour or Tory, and whatever the government does.
Well, the issues on which you have campaigned have been accused sometimes of being rather Labour, and there has been speculation indeed, if a Labour government needed you in the coalition, would you serve with Mr Wilson to govern Britain?
No, we would not take part. I think it is highly unlikely that we would take part in a coalition. We have won seats and we have won votes from both Labour and Tory throughout Scotland yesterday, and we are a two-stage party. First of all, we want self-government for Scotland. The second stage of our party is when we have self-government, and then we talk about the kind of Scotland we want. But we will undoubtedly use what looks like very considerable strength of our group in Parliament with a balanced situation to secure some of the things that we want done for Scotland right away.
In the euphoria of the day, have you had time to analyse what it was, you think, that suddenly made you a serious political force instead of being what some people call just the outsiders who romped in by-elections?
Well, not sudden to me, and we were quite aware of the growth of support for us since 1970. It was shown in the by-elections last year. We've known it from our own organisation growing, and the campaign in this short general election, we welcome the opportunity to have a general election, and throughout it all I was very confident that we would achieve just precisely what we have achieved.
But if you manage to make a real impact on Westminster, would your first prerogative be to separate yourself off from England entirely?
No, that is not our prerogative in any case. We want decision-making in Scotland, but economic interdependence is always the basis of our trading and so on. I think that the Westminster situation is going to be very, very interesting, but we'll use our power there primarily for the benefit of the people of Scotland, but we'll also be there in order to see the economic situation.
Mr Woolf, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you.
And there was William Woolf, the leader of the Scottish National Party. Of course, one of the products of this general election I would have thought was fairly clear was, one might say, that we could be at the brink of the incipient breakup of the United Kingdom, because we have the Scottish Nationalists doing very well at a general election and taking seats. We have the Welsh Nationalists doing their best, and also this United Ulster Unionist Party bears all the traits of a nationalist party in Northern Ireland. Indeed, that's part of the ideas of Mr Harry West and some of the others, and I think Mr Paisley has now, of course, come off his thought of uniting Northern Ireland with the rest of with Britain. Let's have a look at some of these Scottish national results. Here's Stirlingshire East and Clackmannan. There's Mr George Reid, a television personality in Scotland, taking that seat.
That's the biggest jump in the Scottish national vote, up 30%.
Here's Marion Nairn, and that's Winnie Ewing back in Parliament for the second time.
And a cabinet minister defeated for the first time since Tony Barber was defeated in 1964.
And a little look at the Scottish National Party, which will be going to the next House of Commons. Of course, they still have some hopes of results to come. Dundee East, Banff, Marion Nairn, Aberdeenshire East, Stirlingshire East and Clackmannan, and I suppose Argyll is one that they might think. Indeed, they might hope to come in any of the results which we're waiting for.
Western Isles too.
Yes, of course they won't come in Orkney and Shetland because they're not fighting against Joe Grimmond there. A little look at the computer projection of how all this is going to end. There you are, David. Now Conservatives still within 3 of Labour.
But that you can't do any sum there which gives any two parties a clear majority in Parliament if they made a coalition, unless the Conservative and Labour parties join together.
Robert, you got any ideas about coalition building?
Well, no, Alistair, I think you're being very melodramatic, saying this may be the breakup of the United Kingdom. I mean, all over the world, one aspect of disillusionment with majority politics has been the rise of regional politics. In Belgium, for example, in Canada, where French Canada appeared to be going to break up Canada. And I don't think it must be treated as a serious exercise in the destruction of a political unit. it usually ends up as a demand for a better deal for one of the minority areas or minority groups in the community. And we haven't many examples, even Nigeria, of a country actually splitting up.
Well, you had to have a civil war to keep that, Bob, and I don't think we want that.
Also,
but I think
very important, there was only 14% of the people of Wales voted for the Plaid, and in Scotland about 21% voted for the Scottish National Party.
Yes, but let us be quite careful about this, I think. We know that nationalist votes rise when Britain as a whole doesn't seem to be run well and when the economy seems to be in difficulty. And we are now seeing, I think, this happening now very much more than we have seen before. Northern Ireland is a special case. Again, they're dissatisfied with what they think has been their treatment by the Heath government. But I don't think we should ignore this. We all said it wouldn't happen in the past. Now it may be beginning. I just said the beginning of the incipient start to...
That leads to often very desirable devolution of power. That's what usually happens, and better deals for regions, and the nationalists are in that sense bought off.
But if England declared independence from Scotland and Wales, we'd have rather a solid Tory majority.
Always.
Well, almost always, and I suppose part of the compulsory reading is going to be that Kilbrandon report about devolution, which the nationalists and other devolutionists pay so much attention to. Well, I'm sorry that we have to say to the children who've switched on to see the children's programmes here on BBC One, they are now being carried on BBC Two. So if you are not too keen on the political game or anything like that, and we don't think we're holding the suspense of what is going to happen in Britain, you'd like to see the children's programmes, we suggest you now turn to BBC Two. But we're going to have business as usual, the stalemate business, the deadlock business, the incipient this, that and the other business, continuing here. We haven't had any word yet of what Mr. Heath's intentions are, and the afternoon is wearing on. In 1964, in a slightly less complicated situation, I think we were beginning at this time to think of the cars going to the palace and coming back again, but we've had no move from Mr. Heath yet, and we indeed have had little indication of what is going on in his mind. One of the points to make, David, isn't it, is that few Conservative spokesmen have been heard today.
Few Conservative spokesmen. May I just say one thing to the television camera? You don't have to. My three sons, you don't have to stay watching BBC One. You can switch to BBC Two if you prefer the children's programme to this. But
you're very generous, building the audience.
Yes, well, I think.
Now, what about the silence of the Conservatives? This always means a state of indecision in the party and a state of disappointment.
It shows, though, the greater discipline, perhaps, of the Conservative Party, because they do know they can't do themselves any good by saying anything at this moment until they know what they want to say.
And we'll have a little thought now about the seats which we are waiting for, including some of the recounts which are there in italics. Argyll, that's a very late one. Bodmin, they've been recounting since this morning. Ross and Cromarty, always a late one. Carmarthen, the fourth recount is actually just starting now, according to late reports. Western Isles, and then we are in Northern Ireland, Antrim South, Armagh, Mid-Ulster, South Down, Fermanagh and South Tyrone, although we have some indications both from Mid-Ulster and from Fermanagh and South Tyrone that may be going to the United Unionist Party, Londonderry, Inverness, a Liberal stronghold, and Orkney and Shetland, the most northerly seat, and Joe Grimmon's seat up to now. One couldn't be surprised at anything that happens.
Except the Irish seats seem to be much more certain now. We started off by saying no Irish seat was certain. They now seem to be almost all certain. It really is very unexpected compared to what one was being told before the election there.
And, well, that's quite a coup, I would have thought, there for the Unionists who opposed the Sunningdale Agreement, and I would imagine that in that situation it's a reinforcement to Mr. Faulkner, who has found Sunningdale very difficult to sell in Northern Ireland, and I think he will now be saying to the Prime Minister in Dublin that he does need some help on some matters like extradition, some matters like the Council of Ireland, if the Sunningdale Agreement is really going to stick. So that's a very important thing, I believe, in Northern Ireland. Now, for the whole of the United Kingdom, the important place is number 10 Downing Street, and outside there, on continuing his vigil, David Dimbleby.
So far today, we've seen heavyweight figures go through the door of number 10 for top consultations. The latest arrival at 4 o'clock, however, is unexplained to me, which is Mr. Norman St. John Stevens. So here he comes out again, the Minister for the Arts, newly appointed. Might perhaps just go and find out what he is thinking. Norman, can I ask you a question? Do you have any comment on what's happened? Why did you go to Downing Street? Did you go to Downing Street to what? No comment from Mr. Norman St. John Stevens. But I thought for a moment that Mr. Heath might be going to let pass the public lending right and then go back to the country for a moment. I don't know what Norman St. John Stevens was doing there, but maybe he just came to say that he understood how Mr. Heath felt, or commiserated, or whatever. If any more developments here, or anybody else arrives, no doubt we'll be able to tell you about it. David Dimbleby in Downing Street trying to doorstep, not very effectively.
Well, here at Transport House, there's plenty of activity, a lot of speculation, but very little information. 13 members of the Shadow Cabinet have been meeting for an hour and a half now in a room which is guarded by two rather hefty men. The two absentees are Shirley Williams and Michael Foot. The only reason they're not here is that they haven't yet got back from their constituencies. The 13 people in that room are watching two television monitors showing just how impartial they are, no doubt discussing as they see the last few results coming in just who they might be able to rely on if they did have to form a government. Mr. Wilson is also discussing with his colleagues the constitutional position, so that if he does get the call to go to Buckingham Palace, no doubt he will be ready to go. One thing that all the Shadow Cabinet members have stressed as they come in is that they don't see any chance of a coalition. We keep getting news that the meeting is about to break up. We hope you'll be able to come back when it does, and perhaps we can talk then to Mr. Wilson. This is Keith Graves at Transport House.
I wonder if we can catch you, Keith, just before you go. What's the reason that they're giving why they don't want a coalition?
They're not. The only reason that we've been given by anyone that we've spoken to, Alistair, is that Mr. Wilson has said so. So he seems to be very firmly in control. No one has given us any other reason than that. They just keep referring us, when we ask this question, to Mr. Wilson's statements that there will be no coalition.
Well, it's closed doors and tight lips then at Transport House, as indeed we saw there at number 10. But let's go to Liberal Party headquarters and see what the situation is there. Martin Bell.
Well, there was a time when this place seemed more like a morgue than a committee room, so extremely gloomy was it. But this afternoon, Liberal spirit started to revive. One reason for that is some of their chief candidates started romping home. Another was they began to see what an influential, if delicate, position they were in. That was when Mr. Cyril Smith started to play it so canny, and my information is we're unlikely to get any clarification on their position much before the parliamentary party meeting on Monday. What they are going to do is to go all out to capitalise on what they feel to be the moral force of those 5 million votes. That is terribly important to them. For the moment, I think it reasonable to suppose that they'll be waiting for the phones to ring rather than picking any up. Now back to the studio.
Now, Martin, again, before you go, do you get the impression that the Liberals are a little disappointed that nobody's trying to get in touch with them?
They won't say so. I think they're terribly reluctant to give any hostages to fortune. They suddenly find themselves in centre stage, and they don't want to put a foot wrong. I think it's a natural political caution which perhaps comes a little bit difficult to such ebullient characters as Mr. Smith.
But can I just put one other point? Supposing it weren't just the Nationalists and the Ulster Unionists who were holding the balance with the Liberals, if the Liberals had really got their 40 seats, then they would have expected much care and attention to be lavished on them, wouldn't they?
Yes, and I think it's reasonable to suppose that they still expect much care and attention to be lavished on them, not in terms of their seats, which are a large handful, but in terms of their votes, which they think must command respect and attention.
Thank you very much. And so the Liberals are going off on the weekend, although no doubt they can call themselves together very quickly if they need to. We've just got some further news about that Watergate. I think I'd told you about Mr. Mitchell, the former Attorney General, and Mr. Bob Haldeman being indicted. Now the news has come, almost inevitably I suppose, that Mr. John Ehrlichman, who was Mr. Nixon's former domestic affairs advisor, has also been indicted, and there are indeed others who are being indicted. So there is the result of the long investigation and inquiry and hearings there. Let's go to Newcastle now, where we have a report. Well, that is Edward Milne, clearly the independent Labour victor there of Blyth. I'm sorry we don't have any sound there. It looks to me like Mr. Edward Milne. We'll try and get back to him if we can. Plainly, he's had a major personal success in holding that seat, although not adopted by the official constituency Labour Party. A little look now at the computer prediction again. these are the vital figures for all those confabulations that are going on in various parts of London and indeed, no doubt, elsewhere.
When I look at those figures, you know, I suddenly think of the power of any group within that 300 or that 297. Remember Woodrow Wyatt and Desmond Donnelly when Labour had a majority of 3? It seems to me that the right wing or the pro-Europeans within the Labour Party can, in this situation, if Labour is struggling along, exercise a very considerable influence on the policy of the party.
And again, perhaps they would have exercised a much bigger influence, David, don't you think, if the Liberals indeed had got up to 30 seats or so that the polls had been suggesting?
I think there'll be a lot of cross-party contacts in this very, very delicate situation.
It does really look like the first chapter, doesn't it, in what might be rather a lengthy story.
I'm writing a book on this election. I thought my story ended on March the 1st. I'm afraid it may be called the British General Elections of 1974.
Well, we like to keep you busy and keep you interested and keep you keen. Robin, I think you've got a comment on that.
So I've been asking questions all last night and all today. I would permit myself the luxury of one comment with all the humility at my command, and that is I think it's rubbish to talk about a coalition anymore. There's not going to be a coalition. It's rubbish to talk about deadlock all the time. There is not deadlock. There is going to be a government, and the government will be carried on, and it will be a Labour government in all probability. And in my view, it's nonsense to talking about seeing about the breakup of the United Kingdom. Ian Waller, do you agree?
Well, absolutely. I mean, all this theorising by Robert Mackenzie and David Butler on deadlocks and coalitions is absolutely, totally irrelevant to the practical politics of British political life.
Do you agree, Alan
Watkins? Just let me say, first of all, there is no deadlock. As you say, government will continue. And the second point is that there will be no contacts with the Liberals from either Mr. Heath or Mr. Wilson.
Yes.
Alan Watkins,
yes,
can you agree?
Yes, I agree, because coalition, I think, is being misused by some people to indicate not membership of, say, the Liberal Party in a Labour cabinet, but Liberal support for a Labour government. Now, that is not coalition, according to my definition of the term. That's point one.
Yes, I can't understand why Alistair Burnett is in his apocalyptic mood. I think he's getting very tired or something, but no prospect of the breakup of the United Kingdom. And I entirely agree about the use of the word coalition. What he's really talking about is minority government.
There's no deadlock. The Queen's government will be carried on and decisions will be taken.
It's almost impossible to have a deadlock under our parliamentary system.
Well, let poor Alistair get a word in. He's hardly had a word to say all night.
You're quite right. All that I would say, I think, is to echo Winnie Ewing in answering Andrew Alexander. It is Scotland's oil, you know, and I'm watching my passport.
Can I just raise another point? Because in Mrs. Marcia Williams' memorable book about the Labour government coming in 64, Mrs. Williams said, the atmosphere at number 10 was ice cold and very restrained. We were treated, and she's talking about the civil servants, we were treated as ships passing in the night. Is it going to be the same this time?
Marcia Williams has something of a persecution complex about her life at number 10 Downing Street. I think, in fact, she met a lot of civil servants who were extremely cooperative and helpful.
But the general point, is the civil service likely to be anti the incoming Labour government?
No,
I don't think so.
Not at all.
Why not, Andrew Alexander?
It will, because its job is to serve governments of a different complexion, and if you were to, to put it another way, the civil service will do almost anything for any master. If a cabinet member were to go and stand in the middle of Whitehall and say, lick my boots, thousands would be killed in the rush.
Let me put you another quotation from Marcia Williams' book. The first cabinet meeting in 64 was a brave one. Ministers were told the facts, they took it all on the chin and talked hopefully of sticking to the manifesto and the pledges they had made in the campaign. They shook their tiny fists, which were tiny indeed with a 5 majority, and said that we would stick to our main strategy despite every handicap. Will that apply this time?
Well, what happened in 1964 was not quite as Marcia Williams described it, because all the basic decisions were taken by George Brown, Jim Callaghan and Harold Wilson.
Who's taking the basic decisions now?
I would think Harold Wilson, Roy Jenkins and Dennis Healey and or Anthony Crossland.
It's a totally
Robert,
different situation.
on this point about the civil service, I mean, I think most prime ministers feel that, and most cabinet ministers feel, heads of departments feel, that there is a degree of obstruction, delay, procrastination by the civil service, and that they want their own policies pursued. That's a totally different thing from the suggestion Marcia Williams makes, that there was deliberate anti-Labour bias.
Now, I understand that our persecuted minority up there, David Butler, Robert Mackenzie and Alistair Burnett, want to defend their position about coalition, deadlock and the break-up of the United Kingdom.
I don't believe for a moment the United Kingdom is going to break up.
Yeah,
I don't agree with him on that, but I don't think I should have used the word coalition. If I did, I apologise. But what I'm sure is that there will be understandings, just as there were in 1929 and 1923. There were delicate negotiations and constant contacts. You cannot run Parliament without the whips talking about whether you can master a majority at the end of each debate.
But there's no deadlock.
Well, there's a delicate situation.
Well, that's a different matter.
Perhaps through tiredness, the journalists down below
don't be so superior.
Failed to listen to the point I began with very early on in the course of last night, namely that minority governments exist and rule successfully in many parts of the world. In Israel today, in Canada, the third minority government, Pearson never had a majority. I was arguing you can have minority governments, and secondly, but in most other continental countries, there would be a coalition. That's all one said. You can run a minority, you can run a coalition. But certainly I agree, there's going to be a collapse of government the day after tomorrow in this country.
It's disgraceful being misrepresented by the press in that low manner.
You're not in the House
now,
of Lords yet,
let us go on now. I think let's talk about some facts instead of lobby speculation. Dominic Harrod will now tell us what's been happening in the city today.
Well, one of the things that's happened this afternoon is that the pound has recovered slightly. May come as a slight surprise, but we saw this morning, in the first shock of a situation in which there was no immediate answer to the electoral puzzle, we saw the pound fall by a full percent in international purchasing power. It was just about 18% devalued. That's the baseline we use when it started floating. And it floated down to about 19% devalued by lunchtime. But now it's back up again. It's only about 18.5%, with a little bit of help from the Americans. The American dollar had been having a very good time in the foreign exchange markets this morning because there are political problems, as we know, not only in Britain, but also in France, where they've just had a cabinet reshuffle, and in Italy, where the government doesn't look all that stable. The net result was that the dollar had been doing very well against the Europeans. Well, then, later on in the day, one of the major American banks cut its basic lending rate, and that made people think that interest rates were coming down in America. So down came the dollar, and the pound bobbed up a bit. On the stock exchange, it was rather the same story. The stock exchange believed that the Conservatives were going to win this election handsomely. They believed in the opinion polls, and throughout the 3 weeks of the campaign, we saw the Financial Times index of ordinary shares rising, and it rose about 30 points, from just about 300 to slightly over 330. Well, this morning it came back just about 25 points straight away. That was at about 9:30 before the official index was made up. And it's really been going along at about that level ever since. So the people who have to make a market in stocks and shares were surprised, and I'm now talking about 9:30 this morning, when things really did look very confused indeed. The stock market hates uncertainty, and so the gentleman making the market marked down the price of the shares, and it seems as though they marked them down just about the right amount to get a few nibbles of interest from investors. And certainly by lunchtime, most shares were standing slightly higher than at 9:30 or 10 o'clock this morning. But you can't say it was a good day for the stock exchange, because it's a very large fall indeed, Alistair.
Dominic, any indication that the pound has been supported today by the bank?
Very discreetly, I think. Only that. I've talked to various dealers, and they say if there was money going in to support the pound, it was very slight. I dare say we are a little lucky in that the other currencies are fairly weak today as well, for the reasons that I've mentioned. The pound, also, of course, Fridays are always a day when most foreign exchange dealers, who only work a 4.5-day week, I'm now talking about the continental bourses, have gone home, and so there isn't very much business on a Friday anyway. There's certainly been more than normal today because of the political situation, but it hasn't been a day when we've been having to bail out in the 50s or hundreds of millions of pounds or anything of that sort.
And no doubt that the reaction abroad over the weekend may depend a bit on what is said in Britain tonight and tomorrow.
I think that's perfectly fair, and I think that it is probably fortunate for everyone that the Declaration Day was on a Friday, and that this uncertainty, which we have had since 9:30 this morning, still going on, hasn't got 2 more weekdays or 1 more weekday until we decide whether it is to be minority government or coalition, as your experts in the studio can tell you which it's going to be. At least it's very happy that some of these decisions may be sorted out during 2 days when the stock markets and the foreign exchange markets are closed.
Thank you. Well, they all reckon they can tell us what it's going to be, but sometimes it's different from what the others say. Just to say that we hope to have a word with Sir Michael Clapham, who's the head of the CBI later, perhaps getting on about 5 o'clock, that news about Mr. Campbell Adamson, and we'll hope to have a clarification of that from him in just a short while. Just a reminder about the state of the parties at this time. And the Conservatives, of course, now 5 behind Labour, but Labour not having an outright majority in the new House of Commons. Well, we tried to go to Newcastle a short while ago. Remember, we were able to report that Mr. Edward Milne, who had been the Labour member for Blyth, he quarrelled for one reason or another. I think he was talking about the fact of corruption in local government in northeast England, and they didn't adopt him to run, so he ran as an independent. And as Mr. S.O. Davis did down in Wales in the general election of 1970, Mr. Milne romped home at the top of the poll. Have a little look at his figures, in fact. There it is, an independent Labour member. I don't say Mr. Milne would claim that he was the ILP party there. Anyhow, he's got in, and Mr. Ivor Richard, who was fighting it for the official Labour, he came rather a poor second. And Fiona Johnston is interviewing him in our Newcastle studio.
Mr. Milne, you're obviously very exhilarated with the result in Blyth, and yet it was a very tight fight for you. Were you hoping for more support than the 6,000 that you got?
No, I think the majority was just about right. When you're fighting an official candidate and an official machine, you really have a job on your hands.
Do you feel now that you will go on and try and get more inquiries into the Northern Labour group?
Oh, I think this is a warning and a notice to Transport House and to the regional executive of the Labour Party that they ought to have examined Blyth in 1970 when we asked them to. And this was the reply of the people of Blyth at the polling booths yesterday and the result today.
There's been a lot of talk of a possible another election. How do you feel that you'll be able to hold this 6,000 majority if there is another election?
Oh yes, I think it can be done, but you see, the attitude that many of us took at Blyth was that it wasn't us who left the Labour Party, it was the Labour Party that left us, and that we were fighting to get our Labour Party back again in the traditions that we expect in an area like ours.
How will your position be affected in the new Parliament?
Well, I don't think there'll be a great deal of difference. I've always been a member of Parliament with an independent outlook and prepared to challenge even my own government if I felt that the interests of my constituents was at stake. And so therefore I think I can operate just as effectively on the backbenches in this Parliament as I've done in the others.
Obviously Blyth was fought on particular local issues as well as the odd national ones.
Yeah.
How sad are you, as a staunch Labour man, to see Blyth not supporting the Labour candidate?
Well, I think it's sad that that Transport House, that the national executive of the Labour Party allowed some 13 or 14 men at the Labour Club in Blyth to dominate the movement. If they had done something when they were asked, and if the powers that be had really done the job in the way in which they should have done it, we wouldn't have had this trouble at all.
Mr. Milne, thank you very much for coming in.
Thank you.
So there's the face of Edward Milne, sitting as an independent, but no doubt voting to organise the House of Commons on the Labour side from the back benches in the new Parliament. Here's an opportunity to look at Labour's gains, which put Mr. Wilson in his position of potential power this afternoon. Here are the successes that the Labour Party has had, or some of them. Birmingham Perry-Barr, Leicester East, Liverpool Garston, taking it from the Conservative, a bit surprisingly. Preston South, always a swing seat. Northampton North, that's a very marginal one, David, isn't it, nowadays?
It is marginal. The other Northampton, though, stayed with the Conservatives by 100 or so votes.
Gravesend, which is always marginal, tends to go with the winning side. Nottingham West, Kingswood, there near Bristol, and Birmingham Yardley. And we have, of course, more Labour gains to show. These are the situation. Oh, well, before we take those, let's have a look at the Wrekin there. Mr. Fowler back again in the Wrekin, and Dr. Tony Trafford
Redistribution improved that for Labour, and then there's, of course, Telford New Town, so it is made into a relatively safe Labour seat.
It made it rather an uphill fight. Well, we've cut off all the Labour gains. And look at Chorley here, Mrs. Connie Monks, who captured it for the Conservatives in 1970, failing by 405 this time.
A small swing to Labour was enough to put Mrs. Monks out. Unchanged seat.
Meriden, one of the biggest seats in England.
Today has been terribly disappointing for Labour. All the target seats almost failed to turn over, the ones that one would have expected. But here is Meriden, which is outside the expected range, a 7.4% swing, perhaps partly redevelopment outside Birmingham and partly near to Powell country.
And that was the situation at Meriden. We understand that the United Ulster Unionist, that must be Captain Orr, is in Southdown. Of course, Captain Orr has been voting on the Conservative side in the House of Commons for much of his political life, David.
Yes,
it'd be surprising if he stopped now, but perhaps he and Mr. Paisley and these other Unionists are going to vote as a coherent group or
We mustn't
abstain.
talk about deadlocks, but he has got some extra bargaining power in this current situation, possibly.
Well, I'd like the others to speculate on when the next general election is going to be if they don't think it's deadlock. But still, Alan Watson now is still at Conservative Central Office, and he's speaking there to Sir John Foster.
Yes, Alistair, just a bit earlier in the programme you were talking about the silence of the Conservatives, and I think disciplined silence is a very accurate description, really, of what's been happening at Central Office during this afternoon. Lord Carrington's been in, so has Robert Carr during the last hour or so, but very brief visits just to talk to officials here. And the officials do say that it's Downing Street where the action is taking place. That's quite clear. There are also, of course, quite a lot of journalists who are gathering in a room quite near here, just in case Mr. Heath does turn up finally for this press conference. One of the things which the Conservatives clearly are discussing is the importance of Mr. Enoch Powell's intervention in this election. It does appear in certain constituencies to have been very influential, so much so that one can talk about Powell country. I'd like to ask Sir John Foster just two questions about Enoch Powell, really. First of all, what do you think the Conservative Party's reaction to him will now be?
Unfavourable, and I think probably Mr. Powell, as an honourable man, will resign from the party because he committed the ultimate treachery of advising members of his party to vote for Labour.
Treachery is, of course, a big word to use.
Yes, but I think that's what happened.
In effect, do you think the Conservative Party will now exclude him?
Maybe not. They're rather reluctant to take any active step like that, just to disregard him.
You don't accept that in any way he has now proved his case? I mean, after all, he seems to have established his own personal following.
Well, he doesn't seem to have established his case in Wolverhampton, and it's rather doubtful as to whether he established it in the other places. That's a matter of conjecture, I think.
But certainly the reaction will be an angry one, and you would expect him, as you say, as an honourable man to resign.
Yes.
Well, that's perhaps an opinion which will be reflected in other parts of Conservative circles. This is Alan Watson at Smith Square. Now back to the studio.
Well, I think we, Alan, I think we might just have a footnote to what Sir John was saying there. David?
Of the 21 seats that Labour has gained, 13 are in the Midlands, almost all of them in the West Midlands. Isn't it ironic that we're starting to rename the Black Country the Powell Country?
Well, no doubt Mr. Powell himself will break his silence. He's been keeping a disciplined silence about the general election results up to now. Of course, he was busy over the weekend talking about Europe, and no doubt when he does break his silence, that will be listened to as well. We are waiting then for these results, the recounts at Bodmin in particular, which is one which the Liberals still have some hopes of. We're waiting for some results coming from Scotland, and indeed still from Northern Ireland. This is a general election in which there is no clear winner. There may turn out to be an effective winner, but at the moment the government of the country is in the hands of some tightly knit groups of men, Mr. Heath and his advisers in number 10 Downing Street, Mr. Wilson and his colleagues and advisers who've been meeting at Transport House, and also, no doubt, in the hands of the Liberals, who have actually gone off for the weekend officially, and of the triumphant nationalists in Scotland and Wales, who are very happy with the gains that they have made. No doubt they think that's a beginning. And in Northern Ireland, the United Ulster Unionists are celebrating what appears to be a series of triumphs for them. So we're waiting for this political decision to be taken, for the logjam to break, and for action to start. And while we're waiting, we are continuing with this program. If you're looking in to see the children's programs, they are there for you on BBC Two. But we feel that it is the right thing now, with the future of the country at stake, to stay alive and as alert as we can, and to wait for the developments.
In all sorts of ways, it seems to me the rules of British politics are being changed, yet one should stress the force of continuity. 95% of the seats in the next House of Commons are going to be Labour or Conservative seats. The two old parties are still dominating the thing, although we are naturally talking about the new arrivals from Wales, from Scotland, from Northern Ireland, and the increased Liberal force that we shall be seeing there.
And I think the new pressure which must build up, David, given that the Liberals have had this success in votes, I think more and more people who have voted Liberal are going to question whether the present voting system is one which should continue without some judgment being passed on it. Mr. Thorpe has used very strong words today. He's been preaching moderation and he's been preaching cooperation, but he has used the words not only unfair, but cheat about the electoral system.
And the Liberals will certainly get 12,000 votes out of the seats to come, and that'll put them over 6 million votes, more than twice as much as they've got in any election since 1929.
Well, if here's the total vote board showing the Conservatives pulling clear of Labour in the total votes cast, showing the Liberals, as David was saying, just coming up to the 6 million. Now, these are very striking figures, and they are figures which perhaps desiccated minds will try to ignore, but I have a feeling that the whole question of the electoral system is now more open than it has been for many a long day in this country.
It's not only the highest Liberal vote ever, but it's also, by a very large margin, the highest other vote ever.
And the Nationalists will have their say about that too. A little look at what the state of the parties is now. Conservatives running 5 behind Labour. We're giving the Liberals 11. Of course, they still have some hopes to come in, and we are giving the others their 17. That includes a number: Ulster Unionists, Mr. Dick Taverne, the Speaker, and indeed Mr. Edward Milne, whom we just heard from Blyth. Now here's a chance to talk again to Keith Graves about what's happening at Transport House. Keith?
Well, there's scenes of some confusion here, because we've just heard that after 2 hours the Shadow Cabinet meeting has finished. The 13 members who are attending it are still in the meeting. The 2 absentees, I'll tell you just once again, were Shirley Williams and Michael Foot, and the only reason that they're not here is because they haven't yet got back from their constituencies. So all 15 were invited. Of course, that's no indication of what Mr. Wilson has got in his mind. Mr. Wilson will be coming out of the meeting in a minute, and he's going to address a private meeting of Transport House staff. Usually these meetings the press and television are allowed into. They weren't last time, which was a precedent, and perhaps it was because Labour had lost, of course. We thought we were going to be allowed in this time to hear Mr. Wilson's message, but we're not. It's going to be a private meeting. But what we have been told is that the Shadow Cabinet will be issuing a statement in about a quarter of an hour's time. And of course we shall be giving you that statement, which perhaps will throw some light on Mr. Wilson's feelings, just as soon as we get it. This is Keith Graves at Transport House.
And Keith, do you think there's some dissatisfaction among the members of what has been the Shadow Cabinet that Mr. Heath has not acted?
Well, we haven't had a single hint. As I explained before, Alistair, they came in, none of them would be very forthcoming. If you mention the word coalition, for instance, as we did to Mr. Callaghan, he said, "What coalition?" and walked straight on. So there hasn't been any hint of what's gone on in the meeting. All we do know for sure is that they have been discussing the constitutional position for pretty obvious reasons, but there's been no hint at all of any dissatisfaction. Everyone appears to be pretty loyal to Mr. Wilson at this stage. They were all referring us to his statements. Presumably he'd had a quick word with them on the telephone before they arrived to face the cameras.
Thank you, Keith. The thought does occur to me that the Queen has returned to this country after a very busy tour. She's interrupted it. She's had a very long flight. It might well be that part of the delay is because the Queen needs a little time to rest. I think we all would after such a long flight. and it might well be that the action is being geared to suit her convenience. Anyway, that's just a theory. Otherwise, we still haven't had any sort of indication from Number 10 of what Mr. Heath's plans are for this evening. I think that's the delicate way of putting it. Well, now we have in Belfast Mr. William Craig, who is one of the successful loyalists in this election, and Robin Day is speaking to him.
Mr. Craig?
Yes, Mr. Day.
Mr. W.D. Flax indicated that 10 of the Ulster seats would go your way. Do you regard that as a vote of the Ulster people against power sharing, against Sunningdale, against Faulkner and against the British government?
Undoubtedly, it's a very decisive result. The election was fought precisely on those issues and no others.
Do you know, or do you realise, Mr. Craig, that one thing on which the new Parliament will be overwhelmingly united in a tri-partisan majority is to uphold the power-sharing policy and the constitutional decisions of the Heath government?
Well, we shall have to wait and see. The Constitutional Act of 1973 said that such an undemocratic form of power sharing could not be imposed unless it would enjoy widespread acceptance throughout the community. This election proves that it does not have that acceptance, and there must logically be some new thinking.
What is your intention when you come to Westminster? Is it to play a responsible part in the democratic process, or to disrupt it, and as you have tried to do, sometimes physically, in the new Northern Ireland Assembly?
The Parliament at Westminster is the only democratic forum that is open now to the people of Northern Ireland. One can't compare it to the Northern Ireland Assembly. We are going there to play a very active and full role in it.
Will you seek to put the interests of Northern Ireland first and foremost, or will you also take into account the wider problems of the United Kingdom at this difficult time, which of course in the economic sphere affect Northern Ireland as much as everybody else?
Well, naturally we will be very concerned to restore proper democracy to Northern Ireland, but our approach will always take into consideration the well-being of the United Kingdom as a whole.
In view of your claim to be a loyalist, do you not accept the constitutional authority of the United Kingdom over Ulster, even though you don't like its policy? And in view of the fact that that will be upheld by an overwhelming majority, whatever government is in power tomorrow, do you not think that you've got to try and make this thing work somehow?
The United Kingdom Parliament has no right to legislate in an undemocratic way. We have seen recently in Great Britain that the unions have challenged the authority of Parliament to legislate in matters pertaining to the unions.
You are a lawyer, are you not, Mr. Craig?
I am, yes.
Well, you know very well that the United Kingdom Parliament has authority to do any such thing as it pleases, as is practicable within its power, and that is an axiom of our Constitution.
Because I'm a lawyer, I'm aware of the situation more accurately than many of those commenting on it. When the British Parliament passed the Constitutional Act of 1973, they recognised the need to see that government was by consent. And Section 2 of the Constitutional Act specifically provides that this undemocratic form of administration cannot come into operation unless it is likely to obtain widespread acceptance.
Do you accept, finally, Mr. Craig, do you accept that a Labour government would uphold the pledge taken by the Tory government that without the majority consent of the people of Ulster, there would be no change in the border or the constitutional status of Ulster?
Yes, we are aware of that pledge, and we want to see that pledge backed up by policies that are aimed at maintaining the union of Great Britain and Northern Ireland, and not the following of policies likely to lead to the unification of Ireland.
Generally speaking, Mr. Craig, on matters not directly connected with Ulster, will you seek to uphold a minority Labour government, or will you seek to vote against it as a man of what I might call broadly conservative attitudes, or will you seek to bring down any British government on the grounds that it doesn't do what you want in Northern Ireland?
Well, we shall have to wait and see what sort of government we get. We shall look at policies having regard to the merit that we see in them and their effect on the United Kingdom as a whole. There are obviously some matters that we would agree with the Labour Party on. For instance, we share their view that the United Kingdom should not be committed to the common market without a referendum of the people.
So you agree with Mr. Enoch Powell on that?
Very much so.
Thank you, Mr. Craig, for joining us.
And here's a chance to have a little look at a result which come in from Southdown. This is the one, Captain Orr, which we mentioned earlier. But his vote is down. There is a considerable personal vote for Brian Faulkner in that part of Northern Ireland, and perhaps Captain Orr has suffered from it. So, have a little look now at the prediction board. People, of course, are coming, switching on, or perhaps even starting to come home from shopping and soon perhaps from work. And that's the computer prediction of the outcome of this general election of February 1974. Conservatives 3 behind Labour, 14 Liberal seats. The Labour majority over Conservative, as you can see, 3 after 624. Now, Graham, what could change that prediction?
Well, we are waiting for 7 results from Great Britain. The Bodmin result is very much on a knife edge, we feel, between Conservatives and the Liberals. In Scotland, there are 5 results that we're waiting for. Ross is it's not recounting, but we're uncertain. In Argyll, it could go either way, as between the Conservatives or the Nationalists. And Carmarthen in Wales is recounting. So we have all these recounts, and it means that plus or minus 2 on the figures we have could still happen even at this 11:59 sort of hour.
Well, in the common market they're known to stop the clock, so we don't know really when midnight will strike. It's the 4th recount, I think, isn't it, in Carmarthen at the moment? And there's United Ulster Unionists taking Londonderry there in Northern Ireland. Well, this is an opportunity, I think, for us to bring up to date those who are switching on, or, as I say, coming back from the shopping, or switching on because kids are coming home from school and so on. We'll try to put you in touch with what has happened. Let's have a little look at some important Labour gains today. Here's the Wrekin, Mr. Fowler, back again in Parliament, and the man who unseated him in 1970, Tony Trafford, out.
Redistribution had made this a Labour seat, and it's a big Labour majority now.
And here's another seat which the Conservatives took in 1970, lose in 1974.
This is the other gain, a much smaller swing, the other of the 2 gains. Labour's had a lot of disappointments today. The target seats just haven't fallen.
And right in the Midlands of England, Meriden.
Here is the 3rd one, a much bigger swing than was expected. A 7.4% swing put this seat into the Labour column. Mr. Speed is defeated after being there for 7 years.
And as you were saying, David, the Conservatives have hung on in some of their bastions, which might have been overrun had there been a very level swing across the country. So let's have a little look, well, just with that news there of those United Ulster Unionists taking Armagh. Let's have a little look at where the Conservatives held up against the swing. Falmouth and Campbell, Mr. David Mann.
That was a target. There had been a Labour seat from 1945 to 1970, and they might have hoped to get it back, the Labour Party, but they didn't come very near to it. The Liberals took more votes from Labour than the Conservatives.
And Bournemouth, Mr. Adam Butler, the son of R.A. Butler, Lord Butler, holding the seat for the Tories.
A slight swing to the Conservatives in this seat, which has its mining area and Mr. Frank Smith in it.
And here's Beeston. It's a new seat, but the Conservatives held it. They might not have done so.
On our rough calculations, there was a swing to the Conservatives there.
A very marginal one there in East Anglia, and Mr. Christopher Brocklebank Fowler held it.
The old King's Lynn seat, 33 majority last time, and 800 majority this time.
And Mr. James Allison by a narrow squeak, holding Hemel Hempstead after
Very big swing
recount.
to Labour, but Mr. Allison just held on.
And let's have a look now at some other seats which were very close-run things indeed, like that one there in Hemel Hempstead. Just to show you what's happened, here Mr. Bill Benyon taking Buckingham, or holding Buckingham, against the challenge of Mr. Bob Maxwell.
A slight swing to the Conservatives there, with a very well-known Labour candidate trying a comeback.
And in Faversham, down there in Kent, this is a seat which had been Labour for many years, although very marginal. Conservative looks firmly established now.
And one of the more power-light candidates on the Conservative slate.
Anti-common market, certainly. And so the Liberals, of course, began the day with some hopes that they were going to make a bigger breakthrough than they were able to do last night. And, well, they had some mixed results. Here, let's have a look at Berwick-upon-Tweed, a by-election gain which they held on to.
Another recount. They had a recount in the by-election and a majority of 57. Now they have put the majority up by almost 400 votes.
And the Liberal personality, Mr. Pardo, doing very well in Cornwall North.
Some very big majorities for Liberal leaders. Mr. Pardo has got what looks like almost a safe seat and a very, very low Labour vote, I think the lowest in the country.
And in the Isle of Ely, another by-election winner there, Mr. Clement Freud, and that looks a safe seat too on the figures.
He moves from 1,200 to 8,000 majority.
And the Liberal whip, Mr. David Steele, again a very good result for him in Roxburgh and Selkirk.
Moving from a few hundred to 9,000 majority.
But here's one where a by-election winner came unstuck, and Dr. Keith Hampson, the Conservative, recapturing Ripon from Mr. Orstick.
The Liberals held on to 3 and lost 2 of their 5 by-election victories during the last Parliament.
And an old Liberal favourite, Mr. Richard Wainwright, taking an old Liberal seat, the Colne Valley.
And that's because he gained from both Liberal, Labour and Conservative and got back.
And, of course, not just the Liberals having those fortunes, and not just the Scottish Nationalists. Here's Plaid Cymru, the Welsh Nationalists, and this is how they've managed up to date.
Last night, they won Merioneth, which was not their best bet. They won Merioneth by 588 votes from the Labour Party.
And in a better bet, Mr. Daffyd Wigley took Carnarvon.
And they're still hoping for Carmarthen, where there's that 4th recount going on now.
So there we have the Welsh Nationalist, and I understand now that we have Mr. Brian Faulkner in Belfast, and Robin Day will talk to him.
Good evening, Mr. Faulkner.
Good evening.
I'd like to ask you this. Do you think the fact that 9 or 10 of the 12 Ulster seats are going for the so-called loyalist grouping, that this is a vote by the Ulster people against power sharing, against Sunningdale, against the British government, and against Brian Faulkner?
Well, I won't disguise the fact that there are disappointing results from the point of view of our candidates who are firmly supporting the new coalition government in Northern Ireland, pro-Assembly Unionists. But I don't think that anybody anywhere would suggest that you could reasonably take a vote of confidence on a new government, particularly when it's an entirely new concept of government, literally 6 to 8 weeks after it had come into operation. Remember, we only took over our posts on the 1st of January.
Of course,
and
Mr. Faulkner,
so I can't regard this as a referendum.
No, but of course it's the new concept which Mr. Craig and Dr. Paisley, whom I was talking to earlier, it's the new concept of power sharing and what they call a selected executive, which they say the people were voting against.
Yes, but quite frankly, I just don't accept that. I'm quite certain that if you were to take a referendum, and I hope that in the not-too-distant future, there can be a vote taken on the new institutions of government in Northern Ireland. I believe if you were to take that, you would have lots of support, majority support for it. You see, people have been concerned about this Sunningdale. Sunningdale, in the minds of a great many people in Northern Ireland, is some form of halfway house to a united Ireland. There hasn't been the opportunity to show people that it's not. I'm quite convinced that it's not. But there is the fear that it is. And because it is still something that is abstract, it hasn't yet been ratified. Nobody knows what the powers of any Council of Ireland would be yet.
Where would, to use a short phrase, to call it Faulkner unionism, so that we know what we're talking about, where is the voice of that going to be in Westminster? It's going to be small, if at all, isn't it?
It's certainly not going to be, as it looks at the moment, in the Ulster Unionists who are sent there. We shall have to rely on other people to speak for us. But I would say this firmly to all the parties at Westminster. You passed the Constitution Act of 1973. It had your unanimous support. We assume it still has.
May I finally, briefly, Mr. Faulkner, do you think that this British United Kingdom election result is going to increase the incidence of violence in your troubled community or not?
I can't see that it will make any difference to that. But I would say this, that whatever government
takes office now in Westminster, it must make absolutely certain that it maintains a strong security policy in Northern Ireland, and we have got to see that there is real security cooperation between North and South on this island. Otherwise, we won't have peace.
Mr. Faulkner, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Brian Faulkner, a statement from the National Front, which had 54 unsuccessful candidates. It says in a statement that the likelihood of our getting any candidates elected at this stage is remote. Perhaps they can say that again, but they say that they think they've succeeded admirably in making their policies known to a great number of people. Well, of course, if you field enough candidates, you do get party political broadcasts. Well, just resuming, if you have just come in and you're anxious to know, as many people are, what has happened in the general election today and the situation of indecision and stalemate where we are at the moment, which hasn't been broken. If you want to watch children's programs, which are normally on BBC One, they are going out now as usual, but they're going out on BBC Two. We are here because we are waiting to know what the future of the country is going to be and how the present situation is going to be resolved. The situation is that the Conservatives now are 5 seats behind Labour, with the Liberals having 11 and others up to 19. And among those others, of course, we must rank very highly the Nationalists, and let's put particularly now the Scottish Nationalists, who have had rather remarkable success by previous standards. Mrs. Winifred Ewing, their old standard-bearer in Hamilton, winning again this time in Murray and Nairn and defeating the Secretary of State for Scotland.
She put the Nationalist vote up by 22%, almost entirely at the expense of Labour. Labour lost its deposit.
Stirlingshire East and Clackmannan there, Mr. Richard Douglas beaten by Mr. David Reid for the Nationalists.
The biggest increase of vote by the Nationalists, up nearly 30%, mainly at the expense of Labour.
Mr. Reid, a well-known face on Scottish television. Aberdeenshire East here, and taking it this time from the Conservatives.
And it's the biggest Scottish national majority, I think.
And Dundee East, this is a result last night, the nationalist oil specialist, Mr. Graham Wilson, taking Dundee East, as he was expected to do.
He made his mark in the by-election just a year ago. He had failed to win then, he's won it now.
And here's the Banff result. Again, Scottish nationalists taking it next door to Murray and Nairn.
That was the first nationalist breakthrough last night. The nationalists vote up 23%. The expense of all parties, but Labour most.
And plainly a great encouragement to the Scottish nationalists. Now, results from Northern Ireland, which don't yet wholly discourage Mr. Brian Faulkner, but certainly encourage Mr. Ian Paisley, Mr. William Craig and Mr. Harry West. Let's start with Belfast East. There's Mr. Craig's result.
In Northern Ireland, the turnout was down in some places, unlike Britain, where it was almost always up.
Belfast North here, again, a United Ulster Unionist success, and the pro-Assembly Unionist running rather badly behind.
But the pro-Sunningdale forces getting a majority there, 27,000.
And here's another result with pro-Sunningdale forces in a majority, but the Vanguard United Unionist coming at the top of the poll.
Having 4 opponents.
And here's the consolation for Mr. Faulkner, and certainly a success for his deputy, Mr. Jerry Fitt.
Who, after the election, pledged support to Mr. Wilson if it was wanted.
And now out to the county down, and here's Mr. Kilfedder defeating Mr. Roy Bradford, one of Mr. Faulkner's close supporters. And in Antrim North, the result of the Reverend Ian Paisley, which he and his supporters greeted with hymn singing. Mr. Utley is a leader writer on the Daily Telegraph, rather a late comer to that constituency.
The biggest Northern Irish majority for the big man.
And let's just have one for an independent, Mr. Edward Milne, who has held his old seat of Blythe, although he was not the official Labour candidate.
Defying the party machine, like S.O. Davis did at Merthyr at the last election and Dick Taverne did at the by-election and again, yes, last night.
So some communities, quite like the individual, and perhaps the more tightly knit the community, and Blythe must be one, as indeed down in Wales S.O. Davis profited from that, they have kept their favourites in. Of course, Mr Taverne himself back in this election, though his other candidates have not done particularly well. Some results from Northern Ireland which we haven't shown in full. Here's the United Ulster Unionist taking Londonderry.
With a clear majority of the votes.
And the same situation in Armagh. And that brings us up to date in the general election, with still those rather sticky seats, those recounts going on, the fourth one at Carmarthen. Still hope to hear from Bodmin. I hope they haven't forgotten us. We haven't forgotten them. And a little look again at the prediction board here at 4:52. After 625 results, that's 10 to come. And the Conservatives 3 behind Labour on our prediction of the final result, and Liberals 14. And the Labour majority over Conservatives 3.
And 24 others in that board, remember.
And 24 others to put in there. That's the Nationalists, Mr Taverne, the Speaker, and the returns from Northern Ireland. Mr Paisley making it very clear that he wasn't going to be connected with any particular group. And here now, I think, is a chance to go to Birmingham. We've said much about Mr Powell's intervention in the campaign and his possible effect on the results, especially in the West Midlands. Let's go now to Birmingham and Peter Colburn.
Throughout the night here in the Midlands, Eric Rowe, who's a senior lecturer in politics, has been watching the results come into the BBC studio here in Birmingham. He's also been studying elections and politics in the Midlands for a long time. Now, Eric, what sort of patterns emerged in the Midlands as the results have come in?
Well, I think there are two things. First of all, that the Midlands has in some respects followed the national trend and to some extent has moved away from it. And what I'd like to do is actually to look first of all at the general scene in the Midlands and then a look at a special situation in the Midlands, particularly what's called the Powell effect. So if I start off first of all with the general scene, we anticipated that the party's success would be in the ratio of 44 to 44, but it turned out that in fact Labour obtained 52 and Conservative 38, so the Labour Party brought about a gap there of 14, quite substantial. The turnout in the area was up some 7%. As far as the Liberals were concerned, there was a very good Liberal vote, but not a single seat was won in the Midlands area.
We have got this phenomena of minority MPs, people who really haven't had as many votes for them as people who voted against them.
Well, that's true. Of the 90 seats, some 42 are now filled by people who have less than 50% of the votes cast in those constituencies, and 14 Liberals have pushed the Labour into third place in 14 seats. Turning to the Powell effect, which has been being discussed nationally at the present time, and a great deal is being made of it, the situation locally is not to emphasise it so much. For instance, Wolverhampton South West with a swing of 16% and Wolverhampton North East with a swing of 10% did in fact not go in a way other than anticipated. So although the swing was there, it didn't affect the result in terms of seats. It's true, of course, that Dudley West and Aldrich Brownhills went other than as expected, with Dame Patrick Hornsby Smith being defeated in the latter seat. But all local politicians insist that, in fact, the Powell effect has not been substantial.
Do you think, though, Labour would have got the swing in some of the Birmingham, some of the Wolverhampton areas if Mr Powell hadn't spoken out as he did?
No, I think it would be absolutely wrong to suggest that there wasn't an effect. What I think is being suggested locally here is that we do not know at the moment the order of the effect, and perhaps there is a tendency, because of the personality of the man and his general impact nationally, to give too great an emphasis to it.
Isn't it rather odd situation? A man who stood down is the man who's being talked about most as regards Midland seats today.
Well, I think that is true, but bearing in mind the impact that the man has had over the years and the fact that he has been newsworthy and that he has been able to project himself very well, it is in fact understandable, though whether the effect will continue into the future is another matter.
Eric Rowe, thank you.
So that is the situation. Our belief is that this is, of course, and as we can all see, a very narrow election result indeed. It certainly looks as if the Conservatives can no longer have any pretensions to become the largest single party. They can't overtake Labour's total. Conservatives are sweating a bit now, obviously, on Bodmin, which has gone to another recount. They must also be sweating on Ross and Cromarty, which they picked up last time. We won't be hearing from that for a little while.